This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Spy by James Fenimore Cooper. Chapter 8, read by Hugh Maguire. With fire and sword the country round was wasted far and wide, and many childling, mother then, and newborn infant died. But things like these, you know, must be at every famous victory. Poem by Southey. The last sounds of the combat died on the ears of the anxious listeners in the cottage, and were succeeded by the stillness of suspense. Frances had continued by herself, striving to exclude the uproar, and vainly endeavouring to summon resolution to meet the dreaded result. The ground where the charge on the foot had taken place was but a short mile from the Locusts, and in the intervals of the musketry the cries of the soldiers had even reached the ears of its inhabitants. After witnessing the escape of his son, Mr. Wharton had joined his sister and eldest daughter in their retreat, and the three continued fearfully waiting for news from the field. Unable longer to remain under the painful uncertainty of her situation, Frances soon added herself to the uneasy group, and Caesar was directed to examine into the state of things without, and report on whose banners victory had alighted. The father now briefly related to his astonished children the circumstances and manner of their brother's escape. They were yet in the freshness of their surprise, when the door opened, and Captain Wharton, attended by a couple of the guides, and followed by the black, stood before them. "Henry, my son," cried the agitated parent, stretching out his arms, yet unable to rise from his seat. "What is it I see? Are you again a captive, and in danger of your life?" "The better fortune of these rebels has prevailed," said the youth, endeavoring to force a cheerful smile, and taking a hand of each of his distressed sisters. "I strove nobly for my liberty, but the perverse spirit of rebellion has even lighted on their horses. The steed I mounted carried me, greatly against my will, I acknowledge, into the very centre of Dunwoodie's men." "And you were again captured?" continued the father, casting a fearful glance on the armed attendants who had entered the room. "That, sir, you may safely say. This Mr. Lawton, who sees so far, had me in custody again immediately." "Why you no hold 'em in, Massa Harry?" cried Caesar pettishly. "That," said Wharton, smiling, "was a thing easier said than done, Mr. Caesar, especially as these gentlemen," glancing his eyes at the guides, "had seen proper to deprive me of the use of my better arm." "Wounded!" exclaimed both sisters in a breath. "A mere scratch, but disabling me at the most critical moment," continued the brother, kindly, and stretching out the injured limb to manifest the truth of his declaration. Caesar threw a look of bitter animosity on the irregular warriors who were thought to have had an agency in the dead, and left the room. A few more words sufficed to explain all that Captain Wharton knew relative to the fortune of the day. The result, he thought, yet doubtful, for when he left the ground the Virginians were retiring from the field of battle. "They had treed the squirrel," said one of the sentinels abruptly, "and didn't quit the ground without leaving a good hound for the chase when he comes down." "Aye," added his comrade dryly, "I'm thinking Captain Lawton will count the noses of what are left before they see their whaleboats." Frances had stood supporting herself by the back of a chair during this dialogue, catching, in breathless anxiety, every syllable as it was uttered. Her color changed rapidly. Her limbs shook under her, until with desperate resolution she inquired, "Is any officer hurt on either side?" "Yes," answered the man cavalierly. "These southern youths are so full of mettle that it's seldom we fight but one or two gets knocked over." One of the wounded, who came up before the troops, told me that Captain Singleton was killed, and Major Dunwoodie." Frances heard no more, but fell lifeless in the chair behind her. The attention of her friends soon revived her when the captain, turning to the man, said fearfully, "Surely Major Dunwoodie is unhurt." "Never fear him," added the guide, disregarding the agitation of the family. "They say a man who is born to be hanged will never be drowned. If a bullet could kill the Major, he would have been dead long ago. I was going to say that the Major is in a sad taking because of the captain's being killed, but had I known how much store the lady set by him, I wouldn't have been so plain-spoken." Frances now rose quickly from her seat, with cheeks glowing with confusion, and leaning on her aunt, was about to retire, when Dunwoodie himself appeared. The first emotion of the agitated girl was unalloyed happiness. In the next instant she shrank back appalled from the unusual expression that reigned in his countenance. The sternness of battle yet sat on his brow. His eye was fixed and severe. The smile of affection that used to lighten his dark features on meeting his mistress was supplanted by the lowering look of care. His whole soul seemed to be absorbed in one engrossing emotion, and he proceeded at once to his object. "Mr. Wharton," he earnestly began, "in times like these we need not stand on idle ceremony. One of my officers, I'm afraid, is hurt mortally, and, presuming on your hospitality, I have brought him to your door." "I am happy, sir, that you have done so," said Mr. Wharton, at once perceiving the importance of conciliating the American troops. "The necessitous are always welcome, and doubly so in being the friend of Major Dunwoodie." "Sir, I thank you for myself, and in behalf of him who is unable to render you his thanks," returned the other hastily. "If you please, we will have him conducted where the surgeon may see and report on his case without delay." To this there could be no objection, and Frances felt a chill at her heart as her lover withdrew, without casting a solitary look on herself. There is a devotedness in female love that admits no rivalry. All the tenderness of the heart, all the powers of the imagination, are enlisted in behalf of the tyrant passion, and where all is given, much is looked for in return. Frances had spent hours of anguish, of torture, on account of Dunwoodie, and he now met her without a smile, and left her without a greeting. The ardor of her feeling was unabated, but the elasticity of her hopes was weakened, and the supporters of the nearly lifeless body of Dunwoodie's friend passed her, in their way to the apartment prepared for his reception. She caught a view of this seeming rival. His pale and ghastly countenance, sunken eye, and difficult breathing gave her a glimpse of death in its most fearful form. Dunwoodie was by his side, and held his hand, giving frequent and stern injunctions to the men to proceed with care, and in short manifesting all the solicitude that the most tender friendship could, on such an occasion, inspire. Frances moved lightly before them, and, with an averted face, she held open the door for their passage to the bed. It was only as the Major touched her garments, on entering the room, that she ventured to raise her mild blue eyes to his face. But the glance was unreturned, and Frances unconsciously sighed as she sought the solitude of her own apartment. Captain Wharton voluntarily gave a pledge to his keepers not to attempt again escaping, and then proceeded to execute those duties on behalf of his father, which were thought necessary in a host. On entering the passage for that purpose, he met the operator who had so dexterously dressed his arm, advancing to the room of the wounded officer. "Ah!" cried the disciple of Aesculapius, "I see you are doing well, but stop. Have you a pin? No. Here, I have one. You must keep the cold air from your hurt, or some of the youngsters will be at work at you yet." "God forbid," muttered the captain in an undertone, attentively adjusting the bandages, when Dunwoodie appeared at the door, impatiently crying aloud, "Hasten, Sitgreaves, hasten, or George Singleton will die from loss of blood." "What! Singleton? God forbid! Bless me! Is it George, poor little George?" exclaimed the surgeon, as he quickened his pace with evident concern, and hastened to the side of the bed. "He is alive, though, and while there is life there is hope. This is the first serious case I have had to-day. where the patient was not already dead. Captain Lawton teaches his men to strike with so little discretion. Poor George, bless me. It is a musket bullet. The youthful sufferer turned his eyes on the man of science, and with a faint smile endeavored to stretch forth his hand. There was an appeal in the look and action that touched the heart of the operator. The surgeon removed his spectacles to wipe an unusual moisture from his eyes, and proceed carefully to the discharge of his duties. While the previous arrangements were, however, making, he gave vent in some measure to his feelings by saying, "When it is only a bullet, I have always some hopes. There is a chance that it hits nothing vital, but bless me, Captain Lawton's men cut so at random, generally sever the jugular or the carotid artery, or let out the brains, and all are so difficult to remedy. The patient mostly dying before one can get at him. I never had success but once in replacing a man's brains, although I have tried 3 this very day. It is easy to tell where Lawton's troops charge in a battle. They cut so at random." The group around the bed of Captain Singleton were too much accustomed to the manner of their surgeon to regard or to reply to his soliloquy, but they quietly awaited the moment when he was to commence his examination. This now took place, and Dunwoodie stood looking the operator in the face, with an expression that seemed to read his soul. The patient shrank from the application of the probe, and a smile stole over the features of the surgeon as he muttered, "There has been nothing before it in that quarter." He now applied himself in earnest to his work, took off his spectacles, and threw aside his wig. All this time Dunwoodie stood in feverish silence, holding one of the hands of the sufferer in both his own, watching the countenance of Dr. Sitgreaves. At length Singleton gave a slight groan, and the surgeon rose with alacrity, and said aloud, "Ah! There is some pleasure in following a bullet. It may be said to meander through the human body, injuring nothing vital. But as for Captain Lawton's men—" "Speak," interrupted Dunwoodie. "Is there hope? Can you find the ball?" "It is no difficult matter to find that which one has in his hand, Major Dunwoodie," replied the surgeon, coolly preparing his dressing. "It took what that literal fellow Captain Lawton calls a circumbendius, a route never taken by the swords of his men, notwithstanding the multiplied pains I have been at to teach him how to cut scientifically. Now, I saw a horse this day with his head half severed from his body." "That," said Dunwoodie, as the blood rushed to his cheeks again, and his dark eyes sparkled with the rays of hope, "was some of my handiwork. I killed that horse myself." "You!" exclaimed the surgeon, dropping his dressings in surprise. "You! But you knew it was a horse." "I had such suspicions, I own," said the Major, smiling and holding a beverage to the lips of his friend. "Such blows alighting on the human frame are fatal," continued the doctor, pursuing his business. "They set at naught the benefits which flow from the lights of science. They are useless in a battle, for disabling your foe is all that is required. I have sat, Major Dunwoodie, many a cold hour while Captain Lawton has been engaged, and after all my expectation, not a single case worth recording has occurred. All scratches or death wounds. Ah, the saber is a sad weapon in unskilful hands. Yes, Major Dunwoodie, many are the hours I have thrown away in endeavoring to impress this truth on Captain John Lawton." The impatient Major pointed silently to his friend, and the surgeon quickened his movements. "Ah, poor George! It is a narrow chance, but—" He was interrupted by a messenger requiring the presence of the commanding officer in the field. Dunwoodie pressed the hand of his friend, and beckoned the doctor to follow him as he withdrew. "What think you?" he whispered on reaching the passage. "Will he live?" "He will." "Thank God!" cried the youth, hastening below. Dunwoodie for a moment joined the family, who were now collecting in the ordinary parlor. His face was no longer wanting in smiles, and his salutations, though hasty, were cordial. He took no notice of the escape and capture of Henry Wharton, but seemed to think the young man had continued where he left him before the encounter. On the ground they had not met. The English officer withdrew in haughty silence into a window, leaving the Major uninterrupted to make his communications. The excitement produced by the events of the day and the youthful feelings of the sisters had been succeeded by a languor that kept them both silent, and Dunwoodie held his discourse with Miss Peyton. "Is there any hope, my cousin, that your friend can survive his wound?" said the lady, advancing towards her kinsman with a smile of benevolent regard. "Everything, my dear madam, everything," answered the soldier cheerfully. "Sitgreaves says he will live, and he has never deceived me." "Your pleasure is not much greater than my own at this intelligence. One so dear to Major Dunwoodie cannot fail to excite an interest in the bosom of his friends." "Say one so deservedly dear, madam," returned the Major with warmth. "He is the beneficent spirit of the corps, equally beloved by us all. So mild, so equal, so just, so generous, with the meekness of a lamb and the fondness of a dove. It is only in the hour of battle that Singleton is a lion." "You speak of him as if he were your mistress, Major Dunwoodie," observed the smiling spinster, glancing her eye at her niece, who sat pale and listening in a corner of the room. "I love him as one," cried the excited youth, "but he requires care and nursing. All now depends on the attention he receives. Trust me, sir, he will want for nothing under this roof." "Pardon me, madam. You are all that is benevolent, but Singleton requires a care which many men would feel to be irksome. It is at moments like these, and in suffering like this, that the soldier most finds the want of a female tenderness." As he spoke, he turned his eyes on Frances with an expression that again thrilled to the heart of his mistress. She rose from her seat with burning cheeks, and said, "All the attention that can with propriety be given to a stranger will be cheerfully bestowed on your friend." "Ah!" cried the Major, shaking his head, "that cold word, propriety, will kill him. He must be fostered, cherished, soothed." "These are the offices for a sister or a wife." "A sister!" repeated the soldier, the blood rushing to his own face tumultuously. "A sister! He has a sister, and one that might be here with tomorrow's sun." He paused, mused in silence, glanced his eyes uneasily at Frances, and muttered in an undertone, "Singleton requires it, and it must be done." The ladies had watched his varying countenance in some surprise, and Miss Peyton now observed that if there were a sister of Captain Singleton near them, her presence would be gladly requested by both herself and nieces. "It must be, madam. It cannot well be otherwise," replied Dunwoodie, with a hesitation that but ill agreed with his former declarations. "She shall be sent for express this very night." And then, as if willing to change the subject, he approached Captain Wharton, and continued mildly, "Henry Wharton, to me honor is dearer than life, but in your hands I know it can safely be confided. Remain here unwatched until we leave the county, which will not be for some days." The distance in the manner of the English officer vanished, and taking the offered hand of the other, he replied with warmth, "Your generous confidence, Peyton, will not be abused, even though the gibbet on which your Washington hung André will be ready for my own execution." "Henry Wharton," said Dunwoodie reproachfully, "you little know the man who leads our armies, or you would have spared him that reproach. But duty calls me without. I leave you where I could wish to stay myself, and where you cannot be wholly unhappy." In passing Frances, she received another of those smiling looks of affection she so much prized, and for a season the impression made by his appearance after the battle was forgotten. Among the veterans that had been impelled by the times to abandon the quiet of age for the service of their country was Colonel Singleton. He was a native of Georgia, and had been for the earlier years of his life a soldier by profession. When the struggle for liberty commenced, he offered his services to his country, and from respect to his character they had been accepted. His years and health had, however, prevented his discharging the active duties of the field, and he had been kept in command of different posts of trust, where his country might receive the benefits of his vigilance and fidelity without inconvenience to himself. For the last year he had been entrusted with the passes into the Highlands, and was now quartered with his daughter, but a short day's march above the valley where Dunwoodie had met the enemy. His only other child was the wounded officer we have mentioned. Thither, then, the Major prepared to dispatch a message, with the unhappy news of the captain's situation, and charged with such an invitation from the ladies as he did not doubt would speedily bring the sister to the couch of her brother. This duty performed, though with an unwillingness that only could make his former anxiety more perplexing, Dunwoodie proceeded to the field where his troops had halted. The remnant of the English were already to be seen, over the tops of the trees, marching along the heights towards their boats, in compact order with the great watchfulness. The detachment of the dragoons under Lawton were a short distance on their flank, eagerly awaiting a favorable moment to strike a blow. In this manner both parties were soon lost to view. A short distance above the Locusts was a small hamlet where several roads intersected each other, and from which, consequently, access to the surrounding country was easy. It was a favorite halting place of the horse, and frequently held by the light parties of the American army during their excursions below. Dunwoodie had been the first to discover its advantages, and as it was necessary for him to remain in the country until further orders from above, it cannot be supposed he overlooked them now. To this place the troops were directed to retire, carrying with them their wounded. Parties were already employed in the sad duty of interring the dead. In making these arrangements, a new object of embarrassment presented itself to our young soldier. In moving through the field he was struck with the appearance of Colonel Wellmere, seated by himself, brooding over his misfortunes, uninterrupted by anything but the passing civilities of the American officers. His anxiety on behalf of Singleton had hitherto banished the recollection of his captive from the mind of Dunwoodie, and he now approached him with apologies for his neglect. The Englishman received his courtesies with coolness, and complained of being injured by what he affected to think was the accidental stumbling of his horse. Dunwoodie, who had seen only one of his own men ride him down, and that with very little ceremony, slightly smiled as he offered him surgical assistance. This could only be procured at the cottage, and thither they both proceeded. "Colonel Wellmere!" cried young Wharton in astonishment as they entered, "has the fortune of war been thus cruel to you also? But you are welcome to the house of my father, although I could wish the introduction to have taken place under more happy circumstances." Mr. Wharton received this new guest with the guarded caution that distinguished his manner, and Dunwoodie left the room to seek the bedside of his friend. Everything here looked propitious, and he acquainted the surgeon that another patient waited his skill in the room below. The sound of the word was enough to set the doctor in motion, and seizing his implements of office, he went in quest of his new applicant. At the door of the parlor he was met by the ladies, who were retiring. Miss Peyton detained him for a moment, to inquire into the welfare of Captain Singleton. Frances smiled with something of natural archness of manner, as she contemplated grotesque appearance of bald-headed practitioner. But Sarah was too much agitated with the surprise of the unexpected interview with the British colonel to observe him. It has already been intimated that Colonel Wellmere was an old acquaintance of the family. Sarah had been so long absent from the city that she had in some measure been banished from the remembrance of the gentleman, but the recollections of Sarah were more vivid. There is a period in life of every woman when she may be said to be predisposed to love. It is at the happy age when infancy is lost in opening maturity, when the guileless heart beats with those anticipations of life which the truth can never realize, and when the imagination forms images of perfection that are copied after its own unsullied visions. At this happy age Sarah left the city, and she had brought with her a picture of futurity faintly impressed it is true, but which gained durability from her solitude, and in which Wellmere had been placed in the foreground. The surprise of the meeting had in some measure overpowered her, and after receiving the salutations of the colonel, she had risen, in compliance with a signal from her observant aunt, to withdraw. "Then, sir," observed Miss Peyton, after listening to the surgeon's account of his young patient, "we may be flattered with the expectations that he will recover." "'Tis certain, madam," returned the doctor, endeavoring, out of respect to the ladies, to replace his wig, "'tis certain, with care and good nursing." "In those we shall not be wanting," said the spinster, mildly. "Everything we have can command, and Major Dunwoodie has dispatched an express for his sister." "His sister?" echoed the practitioner, with a meaning look. "If the Major has sent for her, she will come. Her brother's danger would induce her, one would imagine." "No doubt, madam," continued the doctor, laconically, bowing low, and giving room to the ladies to pass. The words and the manner were not lost on the young sister, in whose presence the name of Dunwoodie was never mentioned unheeded. "Sir," cried Dr. Sitgreaves, on entering the parlor, addressing himself to the only coat of scarlet in the room, "I advised you are in want of my aid. God send 'tis not Captain Lawton with whom you came in contact, in which case I may be too late." "There must be some mistake, sir," said Wellmere, haughtily. "It was a surgeon that Major Dunwoodie was to send me, not an old woman." "'Tis Dr. Sitgreaves," said Henry Wharton, quickly, though with difficulty suppressing a laugh. "The multitude of his engagements to-day has prevented his usual attention to his attire." "Your pardon, sir," added Wellmere, very ungraciously, proceeding to lay aside his coat, and exhibit what he called a wounded arm. "If, sir," said the surgeon, dryly, "the degrees of Edinburgh, walking your London hospitals, amputating some hundred of limbs, operating on the human frame in every shape that is warranted by the lights of science, a clear conscience, and the commission of the Continental Congress can make a surgeon, I am one." "Your pardon, sir," repeated the colonel, stiffly. "Captain Wharton has accounted for my error." "For which I thank Captain Wharton," said the surgeon, proceeding coolly to arrange his amputating instruments, with a formality that made the colonel's blood run cold. "Where are you hurt, sir? What? Is it then this scratch in your shoulder? In what manner might you have received this wound, sir?" "From the sword of a rebel dragoon," said the colonel, with emphasis. "Never. Even the gentle George Singleton would not have breathed on you so harmlessly." He took a piece of sticking plaster from his pocket, and applied it to the part. "There, sir, that will answer your purpose, and I am certain it is all that is required of me." "What do you take to be my purpose, then, sir?" "To report yourself wounded in your dispatches," replied the doctor, with great steadiness, "and you may say that an old woman dressed your hurts; for if one did not, one easily might." "Very extraordinary language," muttered the Englishman. Here Captain Wharton interfered, and by explaining the mistake of Colonel Wellmere, to proceed from his irritated mind and pain of body, he in part succeeded in mollifying the insulted practitioner, who consented to further look into the hurts of the other. They were chiefly bruises from his fall, to which Sitgreaves made some hasty applications, and withdrew. The horse, having taken their required refreshment, prepared to fall back to their intended position, and it became incumbent on Dunwoodie to arrange the disposal of his prisoners. Sitgreaves he determined to leave in the cottage of Mr. Wharton, in attendance on Captain Singleton. Henry came to him with a request that Colonel Wellmere might also be left behind under his parole, until the troops marched higher into the country. To this the Major cheerfully assented, and as all the rest of the prisoners were of the vulgar herd, they were speedily collected, and, under the care of a strong guard, ordered to the interior. The dragoons soon after marched, and the guides, separating in small parties, accompanied by patrols from the horse, spread themselves across the country, in such a manner as to make a chain of sentinels from the water of the Sound to those of the Hudson. [Footnote: The scene of this tale is between these two waters, which are but a few miles from each other. Dunwoodie had lingered in front of the cottage after he paid his parting compliments, with an unwillingness to return, that he thought proceeded from his solicitude for his wounded friends. The heart which has not become callous soon sickens with the glory that has been purchased with the waste of a human life. Peyton Dunwoodie, left to himself, and no longer excited by the visions which youthful ardor had kept before him throughout the day, began to feel there were other ties than those which bound the soldier within the rigid rules of honor. He did not waver in his duty, yet he felt how strong was the temptation. His blood had ceased to flow with the impulse created by the battle. The stern expression of his eye gradually gave place to a look of softness, and his reflections on the victory brought with them no satisfaction that compensated for the sacrifices by which it had been purchased. While turning his last lingering gaze to the locusts, he remembered only that it contained all that he most valued. The friend of his youth was a prisoner, under circumstances that endangered both life and honor. The gentle companion of his toils, who could throw around the rude enjoyments of a soldier the graceful mildness of peace, lay a bleeding victim to his success. The image of the maid who had held, during the day, a disputed sovereignty in his bosom, again rose to his view with a loveliness that banished her rival, Glory, from his mind. The last lagging trooper of the corps had already disappeared behind the northern hill, and the major unwillingly turned his horse in the same direction. Frances, impelled by a restless inquietude, now timidly ventured on the piazza of the cottage. The day had been mild and clear, and the sun was shining brightly in a cloudless sky. The tumult, which so lately disturbed the valley, was succeeded by the stillness of death, and the fair scene before her looked as if it had never been marred by the passions of men. One solitary cloud, the collected smoke of the contest, hung over the field, and this was gradually dispersing, leaving no vestige of the conflict above the peaceful graves of its victims. All the conflicting feelings, all the tumultuous circumstances of the eventful day, appeared like the deceptions of a troubled vision. Frances turned, and caught a glimpse of the retreating figure of him who had been so conspicuous an actor in the scene, and the illusions vanished. She recognized her lover, and, with the truth, came other recollections that drove her to the room, with a heart as sad as that which Dunwoodie himself bore from the valley. End of chapter 8. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Spy by James Fenimore Cooper, Chapter 9, read by Hugh Maguire. A moment gazed adown the dale, a moment snuffed the tainted gale, a moment listened to the cry that thickened as the chase drew nigh. Then, as the headmost foe appeared, with one brave bound the copse he cleared, and, stretching forward free and far, sought the wild heaths of Var. From Lady of the Lake. The party under Captain Lawton had watched the retiring foe to his boats with the most unremitting vigilance, without finding any fit opening for a charge. The experienced successor of Colonel Wellmere knew too well the power of his enemy to leave the uneven surface of the heights, until compelled to descend to the level of the water. Before he attempted this hazardous movement, he threw his men into a compact square, with its outer edges bristling with bayonets. In this position, the impatient trooper well understood that brave men could never be assailed by cavalry with success, and he was reluctantly obliged to hover near them, without seeing any opportunity of stopping their slow but steady march to the beach. A small schooner, which had been their convoy from the city, lay with her guns bearing on the place of embarkation. Against this combination of force and discipline, Lawton had sufficient prudence to see it would be folly to contend, and the English were suffered to embark without molestation. The dragoons lingered on the shore till the last moment, and then they reluctantly commenced their own retreat back to the main body of the corps. The gathering mists of the evening had begun to darken the valley as the detachment of Lawton made its reappearance at its southern extremity. The march of the troops was slow, and their line extended for the benefit of ease. In the front rode the captain, side by side with his senior subaltern, apparently engaged in close conference, while the rear was brought up by a young cornet, humming an air, and thinking of the sweets of a straw bed after the fatigues of a hard day's duty. "Then it struck you, too," said the captain. "The instant I placed my eyes on her, I remembered the face. It is one not easily forgotten. By my faith, Tom, the girl does no discredit to the Major's taste." "She would do honor to the corps," replied the lieutenant, with some warmth. "Those blue eyes might easily win a man into gentler employments than this trade of ours. In sober truth, I can easily imagine such a girl might tempt even me to quit the broadsword and saddle for a darning needle and pillion." "Mutiny, sir, mutiny!" cried the other, laughing. "What, you, Tom Mason, dare to rival the gay, admired, and withal rich Major Dunwoodie in his love? You, a lieutenant of cavalry, with but one horse, and he none of the best, whose captain is as tough as Pepperidge log, and has as many lives as a cat." "Faith," said the subaltern, smiling in his turn, "the log may yet be split, and the grimalkin loose his lives, if you often change as madly as you did this morning. What think you of many raps from such a beetle as laid you on your back today?" "Ah, don't mention it, my good Tom. The thought makes my head ache," replied the other, shrugging up his shoulders. "It is what I call forestalling night." "The night of death?" "No, sir, the night that follows day. I saw myriads of stars, things which should hide their faces in the presence of the lonely sun. I do think nothing but this thick cap save me for your comfort a little longer. Major the cat's lives." "I have much reason to be obliged to the cap," said Mason dryly. "That or the skull must have had reasonable portion of thickness, I admit." "Come, come, Tom, you are a licensed joker, so I'll not feign anger with you," returned the captain good-humoredly. "But Singleton's lieutenant, I am fearful, will fare better than yourself for this day's services." "I believe both of us will be spared the pain of receiving promotion purchased by the death of a comrade friend," observed Mason kindly. "It was reported that Sitgreaves said he would live." "From my soul, I hope so," exclaimed Lawton. "For a beardless face, that boy carries the stoutest heart I have ever met with. It surprises me, however, that we both fell at the same instant, the men behaved so well." "For the compliment I might thank you," cried the lieutenant, with a laugh, "but modesty forbids. I did my best to stop them, but without success." "Stop them!" roared the captain. "Would you stop the men in the middle of a charge?" "I thought they were going the wrong way," answered the subaltern. "Ah, our fall drove them to the right about." "It was either your fall, or apprehensions of their own. Until the Major rallied us, we were in admirable disorder." "Dunwoodie! The Major was on the crupper of the Dutchman." "Ah, but he managed to get off the crupper of the Dutchman. He came in at half speed with the other two troops, and riding between us and the enemy, with that imperative way he has when roused, brought us in line in the twinkling of an eye. Then it was," added the lieutenant, with animation, "that we sent John Bull to the bushes. Oh, it was sweet charge, heads and tails, until we were upon them. The devil! What a sight I missed!" "You slept through it all."
"Yes," returned the other with a sigh. "It was all lost to me and poor George Singleton. But, Tom, what will George's sisters say to this fair-haired maiden in yonder white building?" "Hang herself in her garters," said the subaltern. "I owe a proper respect to my superiors, but two such angels are more than justly falls to the share of one man, unless he be a Turk or a Hindoo." "Yes, yes," said the captain quickly. "The major is ever preaching morality to the youngsters, but he is a sly fellow in the main. Do you observe how fond he is of the crossroads above this valley? Now, if I were to halt the troops twice in the same place, you would all swear there was a petticoat in the wind." "Well, you are well known to the corps. Well, Tom, a slanderous propensity is incurable, but—" stretching forward his body in the direction he was gazing, as if to aim him in distinguishing the objects through the darkness, "what animal is moving through the field on our right?" "'Tis a man," said Mason, looking intently at the suspicious object. "By his hump, 'tis a dromedary," added the captain, eyeing it keenly. Wheeling his horse suddenly from the highway, he exclaimed, "Harvey Birch! Take him, dead or alive!" Mason and a few of the leading dragoons only understood the sudden cry, but it was heard throughout the line. A dozen of the men, with the lieutenant at their head, followed the impetuous Lawton, and their speed threatened the pursued with sudden termination of the race. Birch prudently kept his position on the rock, where he had been seen by the passing glance of Henry Wharton, until evening had begun to shroud the surrounding objects in darkness. From this height he had seen all the events of the day as they occurred. He had watched with a beating heart the departure of the troops under Dunwoody, and with difficulty had curbed his impatience until the obscurity of night should render his moving free from danger. He had not, however, completed a fourth of his way to his own residence, when his quick ear distinguished the tread of the approaching horse. Trusting to the increasing darkness, he determined to persevere. By crouching and moving quickly along the surface of the ground, he hoped yet to escape unseen. Captain Lawton was too much engrossed with the foregoing conversation to suffer his eyes to indulge in their usual wandering, and the peddler, perceiving by the voices that the enemy he most feared had passed, yielded to his impatience and stood erect, in order to make greater progress. The moment his body arose above the shadow of the ground, it was seen, and the chase commenced. For a single instant Birch was helpless, his blood curdling in his veins at the imminence of the danger, and his legs refusing their natural and necessary office. But it was only for a moment. Casting his pack where he stood, and instinctively tightening his belt he wore, the peddler betook himself to flight. He knew that by bringing himself in a line with his pursuers in the wood, his form would be lost to sight. This he soon effected, and he was straining every nerve to gain the wood itself, when several horsemen rode by him but a short distance to his left, and cut him off from this place of refuge. The peddler threw himself on the ground as they came near to him, and was passed unseen. But the delay now became too dangerous for him to remain in that position. He accordingly rose, and still keeping in the shadow of the wood, along the skirts of which he heard voices crying to each other to be watchful, he ran with incredible speed in a parallel line, but in an opposite direction to the march of the dragoons. The confusion of the chase had been heard by the whole of the men, though none distinctly understood the order of Lawton, but those who followed. The remainder were lost in doubt as to the duty that was required of them, and the aforesaid cornet was making eager inquiries of the trooper near him on the subject, when a man, at a short distance in his rear, crossed the road at a single bound. At the same instant, the stentorian voice of Lawton rang through the valley, shouting, "Harvey Birch, take him, dead or alive!" 50 pistols lighted the scene, and the bullets whistled in every direction round the head of the devoted peddler. Feeling of despair seized his heart, and in the bitterness of that moment he exclaimed, "Hunted like a beast in the forest!" He felt life and its accompaniments to be a burden, and was about to yield himself to his enemies. Nature, however, prevailed. If taken, there was great reason to apprehend he would not be honored with the forms of a trial, but that most probably the morning sun would witness his ignominious execution, for he had already been condemned to death, and had only escaped that fate by stratagem. These considerations, with the approaching footsteps of his pursuers, roused him to new exertions. He again fled before them. A fragment of a wall that withstood the ravages made by war in the adjoining fences of wood fortunately crossed his path. He hardly had time to throw his exhausted limbs over this barrier before 20 of his enemies reached its opposite side. Their horses refused to take the leap in the dark, and amid the confusion of the rearing chargers and the execrations of their riders, Birch was enabled to gain a sight of the base of the hill, on whose summit was a place of perfect security. The heart of the peddler now beat high with hope, when the voice of Captain Lawton again rang in his ears, shouting to his men to make room. The order was obeyed, and the fearless trooper rode at the wall at the top of his horse's speed, plunged the rowels in his charger, and flew over the obstacle in safety. The triumphant hurrahs of the men, and the thundering tread of the horse, too plainly assured the peddler of emergency of his danger. He was nearly exhausted, and his fate no longer seemed doubtful. "Stop or die!" was uttered above his head, and in fearful proximity to his ears. Harvey stole a glance over his shoulder, and saw, within a bound of him, the man he most dreaded. By the light of the stars he beheld the uplifted arm and the threatening saber. Fear, exhaustion, and despair seized his heart, and the intended victim fell at the feet of the dragoon. The horse of Lawton struck the prostrate peddler, and both steed and rider came violently to the earth. As quick as thought, Birch was on his feet again, with the sword of his discomfited dragoon in his hand. Vengeance seemed but too natural to human passions. There are few who have not felt the seductive pleasure of making our injuries recoil on their authors, and yet there are some who know how much sweeter it is to return good for evil. All the wrongs of the peddler shone in his brain with a dazzling brightness. For a moment the demon within him prevailed, and Birch brandished the powerful weapon in the air. In the next it fell harmless on the reviving but helpless trooper. The peddler vanished up the side of the friendly rock. "Help Captain Lawton there!" cried Mason, as he rode up, followed by a dozen of his men. "And some of you dismount with me, and search these rocks. The villain lies here concealed." "Hold!" roared the discomfited captain, raising himself with difficulty on his feet. "If one of you dismount, he dies. Tom, my good fellow, you will help me to straddle Roanoke again." The astonished subaltern complied in silence, while the wondering dragoons remained as fixed in their saddles as if they composed part of the animals they rode. "You are much hurt, I fear," said Mason, with something of condolence in his manner, as they re-entered the highway, biting off the end of a cigar for the want of better quantity of tobacco. "Something so, I do believe," replied the captain, catching his breath, and speaking with difficulty. "I wish our bone setter was at hand to examine the state of my ribs." "Sitgreaves is left in attendance on Captain Singleton at the house of Mr. Wharton." "Then there I halt for the night, Tom. These rude times must abridge ceremony. Besides, you may remember the old gentleman professed a kinsman regard for the corps. I can never think of passing so good a friend without a halt." "And I will lead the troops to the Four Corners. If we all halt there, we shall breed a famine in the land." "A condition I never desire to be placed in. The idea of that grateful spinster's cakes is no bad solace for 24 hours in the hospital." "Oh, you won't die if you can think of eating," said Mason, with a laugh. "I should surely die if I could not," observed the captain gravely. "Captain Lawton," said the orderly of his troops, riding to the side of his commanding officer, "we are now passing the house of the peddler spy. Is it your pleasure that we burn it?" "No!" roared the captain, in a voice that startled the disappointed sergeant. "Are you an incendiary? Would you burn a house in cold blood? Let but a spark approach, and the hand that carries it will never light another." "Zounds!" muttered the sleepy cornet in the rear, as he was nodding on his horse. "There is life in the captain, notwithstanding his tumble." Lawton and Mason rode on in silence, the latter ruminating on the wonderful change produced in his commander by his fall, when they arrived opposite to the gate before the residence of Mr. Wharton. The troop continued its march, but the captain and his lieutenant dismounted, and, followed by the servant of the former, they proceeded slowly to the door of the cottage. Colonel Wellmere had already sought a retreat in his own room. Mr. Wharton and his son were closeted by themselves, and the ladies were administering the refreshments of the tea-table to the surgeon of the dragoons, who had seen one of his patients in his bed, and the other happily enjoying the comforts of a sweet sleep. A few natural inquiries from Miss Peyton had opened the soul of the doctor, who knew every individual of her extensive family connection in Virginia, and who even thought it possible that he had seen the lady herself. The amiable spinster smiled as she felt it to be improbable that she should ever have met her new acquaintance before, and not remember his singularities. It, however, greatly relieved the embarrassment of their situation, and something like a discourse was maintained between them. The nieces were only listeners, nor could the aunt be said to be much more. "As I was observing, Miss Peyton, it was merely the noxious vapors of the lowlands that rendered the plantation of your brother an unfit residence for man, but the quadrupeds were—" "Bless me, what's that?" said Miss Peyton, turning pale at the report of the pistols fired at Birch. "It sounds prodigiously like the concussion on the atmosphere made by the explosion of firearms," said the surgeon, sipping his tea with great indifference. "I should imagine it to be the troops of Captain Lawton returning. Did I not know the captain never uses the pistol, and that he dreadfully abuses the saber?" "Merciful Providence!" exclaimed the agitated maiden. "He would not injure one with it, certainly." "Injure!" repeated the other quickly. "It is certain death, madam, the most random blows imaginable. All that I can say to him will have no effect." "But Captain Lawton is the officer we saw this morning, and is surely your friend," said Frances, hastily, observing her aunt to be seriously alarmed. "I find no fault with his want of friendship. The man is well enough, if he would learn to cut scientifically. All trades, madam, ought to be allowed to live. But what is to become of a surgeon if his patients are dead before he sees them?" The doctor continued haranguing on the probability and improbability of it being the returning troop, until a loud knock at the door gave new alarm to the ladies. Instinctively laying his hand on a small saw that had been his companion for the whole day, in the vain expectation of an amputation, the surgeon, coolly assuring the ladies that he would stand between them and danger, proceeded in person to answer the summons. "Captain Lawton!" exclaimed the surgeon, as he beheld the trooper leaning on the arm of his subaltern, and with difficulty crossing the threshold. "Ah, my dear bonesetter, is it you? You are the very fortunately to inspect my carcass. But do lay aside that rascally saw." A few words from Mason explained the nature and manner of his captain's hurts, and Miss Peyton cheerfully accorded the required accommodations. While the room intended for the trooper was getting ready, and the doctor was giving certain portentous orders, the captain was invited to rest himself in the parlor. On the table was a dish of more substantial food than ordinarily adorned the afternoon's repast, and it soon caught the attention of the dragoons. Miss Peyton, recollecting that they had probably made their only meal that day at her own table, kindly invited them to close it with another. The offer required no pressing, and in a few minutes the two were comfortably seated, and engaged in an enjoyment that was only interrupted by an occasional wry face from the captain, who moved his body in evident pain. These interruptions, however, interfered but little with the principal business in hand, and the captain had got happily through with this important duty before the surgeon returned to announce all things ready for his accommodation in the room above stairs. "Eating!" cried the astonished physician. "Captain Lawton, do you wish to die?" "I have no particular ambition that way," said the trooper, rising. and bowing good night to the ladies, and therefore have been providing materials necessary to preserve life. The surgeon muttered his dissatisfaction while he followed Mason and the captain from the apartment. Every house in America had, at that day, what was emphatically called its best room, and this had been allotted, by the unseen influence of Sarah, to Colonel Wellmere. The down counterpane, which a clear frosty night would render extremely grateful over bruised limbs, decked the English officer's bed. A massive silver tankard, richly embossed with the Wharton arms, held the beverage he was to drink during the night, while beautiful vessels of china performed the same office for the two American captains. Sarah was certainly unconscious of the silent preference she had been given to the English officer, and it is equally certain that but for his hurts, bed, tankard, and everything but the beverage would have been matters of indifference to Captain Lawton, half of whose nights were spent in his clothes, and not a few of them in the saddle. After taking possession, however, of a small but very comfortable room, Dr. Sitgreaves proceeded to inquire into the state of his injuries. He had begun to pass his hand over the body of the patient, when the latter cried impatiently, "Sitgreaves, do me the favor to lay that rascally saw aside, or I shall have recourse to my saber in self-defense. The sight of it makes my blood cold. Captain Lawton, for a man who has so often exposed life and limb, you are unaccountably afraid of the very useful instrument." "Heaven keep me from its use," said the trooper with a shrug. "You would not despise the lights of science, nor refuse surgical aid, because this saw might be necessary." "I would." "You would?" "Yes, you shall never joint me like a quarter of beef, while I have life to defend myself," cried the resolute dragoon. "But I grow sleepy. Are any of my ribs broken?" "No." "Any of my bones?" "No." "Tom, I'll thank you for that pitcher." As he entered his draught, he very deliberately turned his back on his companions, and good-naturedly cried, "Good night, Mason. Good night, Galen." Captain Lawton entertained a profound respect for the surgical abilities of his comrade, but he was very skeptical on the subject of administering internally for the ailings of the human frame. With a full stomach, a stout heart, and a clear conscience, he often maintained that a man might bid defiance to the world and its vicissitudes. Nature provided him with the second, and, to say the truth, he strove manfully himself to keep up the other two requisites in his creed. It was a favorite maxim with him, that the last thing death assailed was the eyes, and next to last the jaws. This he interpreted to be a clear expression of the intention of nature, that every man might regulate, by his own volition, whatever was to be admitted into the sanctuary of his mouth. Consequently, if the guest proved unpalatable, he had no one to blame but himself. The surgeon, who was well acquainted with these views of his patient, beheld him, as he cavalierly turned his back on Mason and himself, with a commiserating contempt, replaced in their leathern repository the phials he had exhibited, with a species of care that was allied to veneration, gave the saw, as he concluded, a whirl of triumph, and departed, without condescending to notice the compliment of the trooper. Mason, finding by the breathing of the captain that his own good night would be unheard, hastened to pay his respects to the ladies, after which he mounted and followed the troops at the top of his horse's speed. End of chapter 9. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, see LibriVox.org. The Spy by James Fenimore Cooper, Chapter 10. Read by Hugh McGuire. On some fond breast the parting soul relies, some pious drops the closing eye requires. E'en from the tomb the voice of nature cries, "In our ashes live." their wonted fires. By Gray. The possessions of Mr. Wharton extended to some distance on each side of the house in which he dwelt, and most of his land was unoccupied. A few scattered dwellings were to be seen in different parts of his domains, but they were fast falling to decay, and were untenanted. The proximity of the country to the contending armies had nearly banished the pursuits of agriculture from the land. It was useless for the husbandman to devote his time and the labor of his hands to obtain overflowing garners that the first foraging party would empty. None tilled the earth with any other view than to provide the scanty means of subsistence, except those who were placed so near to one of the adverse parties as to be safe from the inroads of the light troops of the other. To these the war offered a golden harvest, more especially to such as enjoyed the benefits of an access to the royal army. Mr. Wharton did not require the use of his lands for the purposes of subsistence, and he willingly adopted the guarded practice of the day, limiting his attention to such articles as were soon to be consumed within his own walls, or could be easily secreted from the prying eyes of the foragers. In consequence, the ground on which the action was fought had not a single inhabited building, besides the one belonging to the father of Harvey Birch. This house stood between the place where the cavalry had met, and that where the charge had been made on the party of Wellmere. To Katy Haynes it had been a day fruitful of incidents. The prudent housekeeper had kept her political feelings in a state of rigid neutrality. Her own friends had espoused the cause of the country, but the maiden herself never lost sight of that important moment when, like females of more illustrious hopes, she might be required to sacrifice her love of country on the altar of domestic harmony. And yet, notwithstanding all her sagacity, there were moments when the good woman had grievous doubts into which scale she ought to throw the weight of her eloquence, in order to be certain of supporting the cause favored by the peddler. There was so much that was equivocal in his movements and manner, that often, when in the privacy of their household, she was about to offer a philippic on Washington and his followers, discretion sealed her mouth, and distrust beset her mind. In short, the whole conduct of the mysterious being she studied was of a character to distract the opinions of one who took a more enlarged view of men and life than came within the competency of his housekeeper. The Battle of the Plains had taught the cautious Washington the advantages his enemy possessed in organization, arms, and discipline. These were difficulties to be mastered by his own vigilance and care. Drawing off his troops to the heights in the northern part of the county, he had bidden defiance to the attacks of the royal army, and Sir William Howe fell back to the enjoyment of his barren conquest, a deserted city. Never afterwards did the opposing armies make the trial of strength within the limits of Westchester, yet hardly a day passed that the partisans did not make their inroads, or a sun rise, that the inhabitants were spared the relation of excesses which the preceding darkness had served to conceal. Most of the movements of the peddler were made at the hours which others allotted to repose. The evening sun would frequently leave him at one extremity of the country, and the morning find him at the other. His pack was his never-failing companion, and there were those who closely studied him in his moments of traffic, and thought his only purpose was the accumulation of gold. He would be often seen near the highlands, with a body bending under its load, and again near the Harlem River, traveling with lighter steps, with his face towards the setting sun. But these glances at him were uncertain and fleeting. The intermediate time no eye could penetrate. For months he disappeared, and no traces of his course were ever known. Strong parties held the heights of Harlem, and the northern end of Manhattan Island was bristling with the bayonets of the English sentinels. Yet the peddler glided among them unnoticed and uninjured. His approaches to the American lines were also frequent, but generally so conducted as to baffle pursuit.
Many a sentinel, placed in the gorges of the mountains, spoke of a strange figure that had been seen gliding by them in the mists of the evening. These stories reached the ears of the officers, and, as we have related, in 2 instances the traitor had fallen into the hands of the Americans. The first time he had escaped from Lawton, shortly after his arrest, but the second he was condemned to die. On the morning of his intended execution, the cage was opened, but the bird has flown. This extraordinary escape had been made from the custody of a favorite officer of Washington, and sentinels who had been thought worthy to guard the person of the commander-in-chief. Bribery and treason could not be imputed to men so well esteemed, and the opinion gained ground among the common soldiery that the peddler had dealings with the Dark One. Katy, however, always repelled this option with indignation, for within the recesses of her own bosom, the housekeeper, in ruminating on the events, concluded that the evil spirit did not pay in gold, nor, continued the wary spinster in her cogitations, does Washington. Paper and promises were all that the leader of the American troops could dispense to his servants. After the alliance with France, when silver became more abundant in the country, although the scrutinizing eyes of Katy never let any opportunity of examining into the deer-skin purse pass unimproved, she was never able to detect the image of Louis intruding into the presence of the well-known countenance of George III. In short, the secret hoard of Harvey sufficiently showed in its contents that all its contributions had been received from the British. The house of Birch had been watched at different times by the Americans with a view to his arrest, but never with success. The reputed spy possessing a secret means of intelligence that invariably defeated their schemes. Once, when a strong body of the Continental Army held the 4 Corners for a whole summer, orders had been received from Washington himself never to leave the door of Harvey Birch unwatched. The command was rigidly obeyed, and during this long period the peddler was unseen. The detachment was withdrawn, and the following night Birch re-entered his dwelling. The father of Harvey had been greatly molested in consequence of the suspicious character of the son. But, notwithstanding the most minute scrutiny into the conduct of the old man, no fact could be substantiated against him to his injury, and his property was too small to keep alive the zeal of patriots by profession. Its confiscation and purchase would not have rewarded their trouble. Age and sorrow were now about to spare him further molestation, for the lamp of life had been drained of its oil. The recent separation of the father and son had been painful, but they had submitted in obedience to what both thought a duty. The old man had kept his dying situation a secret from the neighborhood, in the hope that he might still have the company of his child in his last moments. The confusion of the day, and his increasing dread that Harvey might be too late, helped to hasten the event he would fain arrest for a little while. As night set in, his illness increased to such a degree that the dismayed housekeeper sent a truant boy, who had shut up himself with them during the combat, to the Locusts in quest of a companion to cheer her solitude. Caesar alone could be spared, and loaded with edibles and cordials by the kind-hearted Miss Peyton. The black had been dispatched on his duty. The dying man was past the use of medicines, and his chief anxiety seemed to center in a meeting with his child. The noise of the chase had been heard by the group in the house, but its cause was not understood, and as both the black and Katy were apprised of the detachment of American horse being below them, they supposed it to proceed from the return of that party. They heard the dragoons as they moved slowly by the building, but in compliance with the prudent injunction of the black, the housekeeper forbore to indulge her curiosity. The old man had closed his eyes, and his attendants believed him to be asleep. The house contained 2 large rooms, and as many small ones. One of the former served for kitchen and sitting room.
In the other lay the father of Birch. Of the latter, one was a sanctuary of the Vestal, and the other contained the stock of provisions. A huge chimney of stone rose in the center, serving, of itself, for a partition between the larger rooms, and fireplaces of corresponding dimensions were in each apartment. A bright flame was burning in that of the common room, and within the very jambs of its monstrous jaws sat Caesar and Katy, at the time of which we write. The African was impressing his caution on the housekeeper, and commenting on the general danger of indulging an idle curiosity. "Best never tempt a Satan," said Caesar, rolling up his eyes till the whites glistened by the glare of the fire. "I bury like hisself to lose an ear for carrying a little bit of a letter. Dere much mischief come of curiosity. If dere'd never been a man curious to see in Africa, dere would be no colored people out of dere own country. But I wish Harvey get back." "It is very disregardful in him to be away at such a time," said Katy, imposingly. "Suppose now his father wanted to make his last will and testament. Who is there to do so solemn and awful an act for him? Harvey is a very wasteful and very disrespectful man." "Perhaps he make him afore." "It would not be a wonderment if he had," returned the housekeeper. "He is whole days looking into the Bible." "Then he read a very good book," said the black solemnly. "Miss Fanny readin' him to Dinah now and then." "You are right, Caesar. The Bible is the best of books, and one that reads it as often as Harvey's father should have the best reasons for so doing. This is no more than common sense." She rose from her seat, and stealing softly to a chest of drawers in the room of the sick man, she took from it a large Bible, heavily bound, and secured with strong clasps of brass, with which she returned to the negro. The volume was eagerly opened, and they proceeded instantly to examine its pages. Katy was far from an expert scholar, and to Caesar the characters were absolutely strangers. For some time the housekeeper was occupied in finding out the word Matthew, in which she had no sooner succeeded than she pointed out the word with great complacency to the attentive Caesar. "Very well, now look him true," said the black, peeping over the housekeeper's shoulders, as he held a long, lank candle of yellow tallow, in such a manner as to throw its feeble light on the volume. "Yes, but I must begin with the very beginning of the book," replied the other, turning the leaves carefully back, until moving to it once she lighted upon a page covered with writing. "Here," said the housekeeper, shaking with the eagerness of expectation, "here are the very words themselves. Now I would give the world itself to know whom he has left the big silver shoe buckles to." "Read 'em," said Caesar laconically. "And the black walnut drawers, for Harvey could never want furniture of that quality as long as he is a bachelor." "Why, he no want 'em as well as he fader." "And the 6 silver tablespoons. Harvey always uses the iron." "Perhaps he say without so much talk," returned the sententious black, pointing one of his crooked and dingy fingers at the open volume. Thus repeatedly advised and impelled by her own curiosity, Katy began to read. Anxious to come to the part which most interested herself, she dipped at once into the center of the subject. "Chester Birch, born September 1st, 1755, read the spinster with a deliberation that did no great honor to her scholarship. "Well, what he give him?" "Abigail Birch, born July 12th, 1757, continued the housekeeper in the same tone. "I think you ought to give her the spoon." "June 1st, 1760. On this awful day, the judgment of an offended God lighted on my house." A heavy groan from the adjoining room made the spinster instinctively close to the volume, and Caesar, for a moment, shook with fear. Neither possessed sufficient resolution to go and examine the condition of the sufferer, but his heavy breathing continued as usual. Katy dared not, however, reopen the Bible, and carefully securing its clasps, it was laid on the table in silence. Caesar took his chair again, and after looking timidly round the room, remarked, "I thought he time more come." "No," said Katy, solemnly. "He would live till the tide is out, or the first cock crows in the morning." "Poor man," continued the black, nestling still farther into the chimney corner. "I hope he lay quiet after he die." "'Twould be no astonishment to me if he didn't, for they say an unquiet life makes an uneasy grave. Johnny Birch a very good man in he way. All mankind can't be a minister, for if he do, who would be the congregation? Ah, Caesar, he's only good who does good. Can you tell me why honestly gotten gold should be hidden in the bowels of the earth?" "Grach, I think it must be to keep the Skinner from finding him. If he know where he be, why don't he dig him up?" "There may be reasons not comprehensible to you," said Katy, moving her chair so that her clothes covered the charmed stone, underneath which lay the secret treasures of the peddler, unable to refrain from speaking of what she would have been very unwilling to reveal. But a rough outside often holds a smooth inside. Caesar stared around the building, unable to fathom the hidden meaning of his companion, when his roving eyes suddenly became fixed, and his teeth chattered with affright. The change in the countenance of the black was instantly perceived by Katy, and turning her face, she saw the peddler himself, standing within the door of the room. "Is he alive?" asked Birch tremulously, and seemingly afraid to receive the answer. "Surely," said Katy, rising hastily, and officiously offering her chair. "He must live till day, or till the tide is down." Disregarding all but the fact that his father still lived, the peddler stole urgently into the room of his dying parent. The tie which bound the father and son was of no ordinary kind. In the wide world they were all to each other. Had Katy but read a few lines further in the record, she would have seen the sad tale of their misfortunes. At one blow, competence and kindred had been swept from them, and from that day to the present hour, persecution and distress had followed their wandering steps. Approaching the bedside, Harvey leaned his body forward, and, in a voice nearly choked by his feelings, he whispered near the ear of the sick, "Father, do you know me?" The parent slowly opened his eyes, and a smile of satisfaction passed over his pallid features, leaving behind it the impression of death, more awful by the contrast. The peddler gave a restorative he had brought with him to the parched lips of the sick man, and for a few minutes new vigor seemed imparted to his frame. He spoke but slowly and with difficulty. Curiosity kept Katy silent. Awe had the same effect on Caesar, and Harvey seemed hardly to breathe as he listened to the language of the departing spirit. "My son," said the father in a hollow voice, "God is as merciful as he is just. If I threw the cup of salvation from my lips when a youth, he graciously offers it to me in mine age. He is chastised to purify, and I go to join the spirits of our lost family. In a little while, my child, you will be alone. I know you too well not to foresee you will be a pilgrim through life. The bruised reed may endure, but it will never rise. You have that within you, Harvey, that will guide you aright. Persevere as you've begun, for the duties of life are never to be neglected, and—" A noise in the adjoining room interrupted the dying man, and the impatient peddler hastened to learn the cause, followed by Katy and the black. The first glance of his eye on the figure in the doorway told the trader but too well his errand, and the fate that probably awaited himself. The intruder was a man still young in years, but his lineaments bespoke a mind long agitated by evil passions. His dress was of the meanest materials, and so ragged and unseemly as to give him the appearance of studied poverty. His hair was prematurely whitened, and his sunken, lowering eye avoided the bold, forward look of innocence. There was a restlessness in his movements, and an agitation in his manner that proceeded from the workings of the foul spirit within him, and which was not less offensive to others than distressing to himself. This man was a well-known leader of one of those gangs of marauders who infested the country with a semblance of patriotism, and who were guilty of every grade of offense, from simple theft up to murder. Behind him stood several other figures clad in a similar manner, but whose countenances expressed nothing more than the indifference of brutal insensibility. They were well armed with muskets and bayonets, and provided with the usual implements of foot soldiers. Harvey knew resistance to be vain, and quietly submitted to their directions. In the twinkling of an eye, both he and Caesar were stripped of their decent garments, and made to exchange clothes with two of the filthiest of the band. They were then placed in separate corners of the room, and, under the muzzles of the muskets, required faithfully to answer such interrogations as were put to them. "Where is your pack?" was the first question to the peddler. "Hear me," said Birch, trembling with agitation. "In the next room is my father, now in the agonies of death. Let me go to him, receive his blessings, and close his eyes, and you shall have all, aye, all. Answer me as I put the questions, or this musket shall send you to keep the old driveler company. Where is your pack?" "I will tell you nothing unless you let me go to my father," said the peddler resolutely. His persecutor raised his arm with a malicious sneer, and was about to execute his threat, when one of his companions checked him. "What would you do?" he said. "You surely forget the reward. Tell us, where are your goods, and you shall go to your father." Birch complied instantly, and a man was dispatched in quest of the booty. He soon returned, throwing the bundle on the floor, swearing it was as light as feathers. "Aye," cried the leader, "there must be more gold somewhere for what it did contain. Give us your gold, Mr. Birch. We know you have it. You will not take Continental, not you." "You break your faith," said Harvey. "Give us your gold!" exclaimed the other furiously, pricking the peddler with his bayonet until the blood followed his pushes in the streams. At this instant a slight movement was heard in the adjoining room, and Harvey cried, let me go to my father, and you shall have all." "I swear you shall go then," said the Skinner. "Here, take the trash," cried Birch, and he threw aside the purse, which he had contrived to conceal, notwithstanding the change in his garments. The robber raised it from the floor with a hellish laugh. "Aye, but it shall be your father in heaven." "Monster, have you no feeling, no faith, no honesty?" "To hear him, one would think there was not a rope around his neck already," said the other, laughing. "There is no necessity for your being uneasy, Mr. Birch. If the old man gets a few hours the start of you in the journey, you will be sure to follow him before noon tomorrow." This unfeeling communication had no effect on the peddler, who listened with gasping breath to every sound from the room of his parent until he heard his own name spoken in the hollow, sepulchral tones of death. Birch could endure no more, but shrieking out, "Father! Hush, father! I come, I come!" he darted by his keeper, and was the next moment pinned to the wall by the bayonet of another of the band. Fortunately, his quick motion had caused him to escape a thrust aimed at his life, and it was by his clothes only that he was confined. "No, Mr. Birch," said the Skinner, "we know you too well to trust you out of sight. Your gold, your gold." "You have it," said the peddler, writhing in agony. "Aye, we have the purse, but you have more purses. King George is a prompt paymaster, and you've done him many a piece of good service. Where is your hoard? Without it you will never see your father." "Remove the stone underneath the woman," cried the peddler eagerly. "Remove the stone." He raves!" said Katy instinctively, moving her position to a different stone from the one which she had been standing. In a moment it was torn from its bed, and nothing but earth was seen beneath. "He raves! You have driven him from his right mind," continued the trembling spinster. "Would any man in his senses keep gold under a hearth?" "Peace, babbling fool!" cried Harvey. "Lift the corner stone, and you will find that which will make you rich, and me a beggar." "And then you will be despisable," said the housekeeper bitterly. "A peddler without goods and without money is sure to be despisable." "There will be enough left to pay for his halter," cried the Skinner, who was not slow to follow the instructions of Harvey, soon lighting upon a store of English guineas. The money was quickly transferred to a bag, notwithstanding the declarations of the spinster that her dues were unsatisfied, and that, of right, 10 of the guineas were her property. Delighted with a prize that greatly exceeded their expectations, the band prepared to depart, intending to take the peddler with them. in order to give him up to the American troops above, and to claim the reward offered for his apprehension. Everything was ready, and they were about to lift Birch in their arms, for he resolutely refused to move an inch, when a form appeared in their midst, which appalled the stoutest heart among them. The father had risen from his bed, and he tottered forth at the cries of his son. Around his body was thrown the sheet of the bed, and his fixed eye and haggard face gave him the appearance of a being from another world. Even Katy and Caesar thought it was the spirit of the elder Birch, and they fled the house, followed by the alarmed Skinners in a body. The excitement which had given the sick man strength soon vanished, and the peddler, lifting him in his arms, reconveyed him to his bed. The reaction of the system which followed hastened to close the scene. The glazed eye of the father was fixed upon the son. His lips moved, but his voice was unheard. Harvey bent down, and with the parting breath of his parent, received his dying benediction. A life of privation and of wrongs embittered most of the future hours of the peddler. But under no sufferings and in no misfortunes, the subject of poverty and obloquy, the remembrance of that blessing never left him. It constantly gleamed over the images of the past, shedding a holy radiance around his saddest hours of despondency. It cheered the prospect of the future with the prayers of a pious spirit, and it brought the sweet assurance of having faithfully discharged the sacred offices of filial love. The retreat of Caesar and the spinster had been too precipitate to admit of much calculation, yet they themselves instinctively separated from the Skinners. After fleeing a short distance they paused, and the maiden commenced in a solemn voice. "Oh, Caesar, was it not dreadful to walk before he had been lain in his grave? It must have been the money that disturbed him. They say Captain Kidd walks near the spot where he buried gold in the old war." "I never think Johnny Birch had such a big eye," said the African, his teeth yet chattering with the fright. "I'm sure 'twould be a botherment to a living soul to lose so much money. Harvey will be nothing but an utterly despisable, poverty-stricken wretch. I wonder who he thinks would even be his housekeeper." "Maybe a spook take away Harvey, too," observed Caesar, moving still nearer to the side of the maiden. But a new idea had seized the imagination of the spinster. She thought it not improbable that the prize had been forsaken in the confusion of the retreat, and after deliberating and reasoning for some time with Caesar, they determined to venture back and ascertain this important fact, and, if possible, learn what had been the fate of the peddler. Much time was spent in cautiously approaching the dreaded spot, and as the spinster had sagaciously placed herself in the line of the retreat of the Skinners, every stone was examined in the progress in search of the abandoned gold. But although the suddenness of the alarm and the cry of the Caesar had impelled the freebooters to so hastily retreat, they grasped the hoard with a hold that death itself would not have loosened. Perceiving everything to be quiet within, Katy at length mustered resolution to enter the dwelling, where she found the peddler, with a heavy heart, performing the last sad offices for the dead. A few words sufficed to explain to Katy the nature of her mistake, but Caesar continued to his dying day to astonish the sable inmates of the kitchen with learned dissertations on spooks, and to relate how direful was the appearance of that Johnny Birch. The danger compelled the peddler to abridge even the short period that American custom leaves the deceased with us, and, aided by the black and Katy, his painful task was soon ended. Caesar volunteered to walk a couple of miles, with orders to a carpenter, and, the body being habited in its ordinary attire, was left, with a sheet thrown decently over it, to await the return of the messenger. The Skinners had fled precipitately to the wood, which was but a short distance from the house of Birch, and once safely sheltered within its shades, they halted and mustered their panic-stricken forces. "What, in the name of fury, seized your coward hearts?" cried their dissatisfied leader, drawing his breath heavily. "The same question might be asked of yourself," returned one of the band, sullenly. "From your fright I thought a party of Delancey's men were upon us. Oh, you brave gentlemen at a race!" "We follow our captain." "Then follow me back, and let us secure the scoundrel and receive the reward." Yes, and by the time we reach the house, that black rascal will have the mad Virginian upon us. By my soul, I would rather meet 50 cowboys than that single man." "Fool!" cried the enraged leader. "Don't you know Dunwoodie's horses are at the Corners, full 2 miles from here? I care not where the dragoons are, but I will swear that I saw the Captain Lawton enter the house of old Wharton, while I lay watching an opportunity of getting the British colonel's horse from the stable. And if he should come, won't a bullet silence a dragoon from the south as well as from old England? Aye, but I don't choose a hornet's nest about my ears. Razz the skin of one of that corps, and you will never see another peaceable night's foraging again." "Well," muttered the leader as they retired deeper into the wood, "this Scottish peddler will stay to see the old devil buried. And though we cannot touch him at the funeral, for that would raise every old woman and priest in America against us, he'll wait to look after the movables, and tomorrow night shall wind up his concerns." With this threat they withdrew to one of their usual places of resort, until darkness should again give an opportunity of marauding on the community without danger of detection. End of chapter 10.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Caroline Morse. The Spy by James Fenimore Cooper. Chapter 11. Quote, "O woe, O woeful, woeful, woeful day! Most lamentable day, most woeful day, that ever I did yet behold. O day, O day, O day, O hateful day! Never was seen so black a day as this. O woeful day, O woeful day!" Shakespeare. End quote. The family at the Locusts had slept, or watched, through all the disturbances at the cottage of Birch, in perfect ignorance of their occurrence. The attacks of the Skinners were always made with so much privacy as to exclude the sufferers, not only from succor, but frequently, through a dread of future depredations, from the commiseration of their neighbors also. Additional duties had drawn the ladies from their pillows at an hour somewhat earlier than usual, and Captain Lawton, notwithstanding the sufferings of his body, had risen in compliance with a rule from which he never departed, of sleeping but 6 hours at a time. This was one of the few points in which the care of the human frame was involved, on which the trooper and the surgeon of horse were ever known to agree. The doctor had watched during the night by the side of the bed of Captain Singleton, without once closing his eyes. Occasionally he would pay a visit to the wounded Englishman, who, being more hurt in the spirit than in the flesh, tolerated the interruptions with a very ill grace, and once, for an instant, he ventured to steal softly to the bed of his obstinate comrade, and was near succeeding in obtaining a touch of his pulse, when a terrible oath, sworn by the trooper in a dream, startled the prudent surgeon, and warned him of a trite saying in the corps, that Captain Lawton always slept with one eye open. This group had assembled in one of the parlors as the sun made its appearance over the eastern hill, dispersing the columns of fog which had enveloped the lowland. Miss Peyton was looking from a window in the direction of the tenement of the peddler, and was expressing a kind anxiety after the welfare of the sick man, when the person of Katy suddenly emerged from the dense covering of an earthly cloud, whose mists were scattering before the cheering rays of the sun, and was seen making hasty steps towards the Locusts. There was that in the air of the housekeeper which bespoke distress of an unusual nature, and the kind-hearted mistress of the Locusts opened the door of the room with the benevolent intention of soothing a grief that seemed so overwhelming. A nearer view of the disturbed features of the visitor confirmed Miss Peyton in her belief, and with the shock that gentle feelings ever experience at a sudden and endless separation from even the meanest of their associates, she said hastily, "Katy, is he gone?" "No, ma'am," replied the disturbed damsel with great bitterness. "He is not yet gone, but he may go as soon as he pleases now, for the worst is done. I do verily believe, Miss Peyton, they haven't so much as left him money enough to buy him another suit of clothes to cover his nakedness, and those he has on are none of the best, I can tell you." "How," exclaimed the other, astonished, "could anyone have the heart to plunder a man in such distress?" "Hearts," repeated Katy, catching her breath. "Men like them have no bowels at all. Plunder and distress indeed! Why, ma'am, there were in the iron pot in plain sight 54 guineas of gold, besides what lay underneath, which I couldn't count without handling, and I didn't like to touch it, for they say that another's gold is apt to stick, so, judging from that in sight, there wasn't less than 200 guineas, besides what might have been in the deerskin purse. But Harvey is little better now than a beggar, and a beggar, Miss Jeanette, is the most awfully despisable of all earthly creatures." "Poverty is to be pitied, not despised," said the lady, still unable to comprehend the extent of the misfortune that had befallen her neighbor during the night. "But how is the old man, and how does this loss affect him much?" The countenance of Katy changed from the natural expression of concern to the set form of melancholy, as she answered, "He is happily removed from the cares of the world. The chinking of the money made him get out of his bed, and the poor soul found the shock too great for him. He died about 2 hours and 10 minutes before the cock crowed, as near as we can say." She was interrupted by the physician, who, approaching, inquired with much interest the nature of the disorder. Glancing her eye over the figure of this new acquaintance, Katy instinctively adjusted her dress, replied, "'Twas the troubles of the times and the loss of property that brought him down. He wasted from day to day, and all my care and anxiety were lost. For now Harvey is no better than a beggar, and who is there to pay me for what I have done?" "God will reward you for all the good you have done," said Miss Peyton mildly. "Yes," interrupted the spinster hastily, and with an air of reverence that was instantly succeeded by an expression that denoted more of worldly care. "But then I have left my wages for 3 years past in the hands of Harvey, and how am I to get them? My brothers told me again and again to ask for my money, but I always thought accounts between relations were easily settled." "Were you related then to Birch?" asked Miss Peyton, observing her to pause. "Why," returned the housekeeper, hesitating a little, "I thought we were as good as so. I wonder if I have no claim on the house and garden. Though they say, now it is Harvey's, it will surely be confiscated." Turning to Lawton, who had been sitting in one posture with his piercing eyes lowering at her through his thick brows, in silence, "Perhaps this gentleman knows. He seems to take an interest in my story." "Madame," said the trooper, bowing very low, "both you and the tale are extremely interesting." Katy smiled involuntarily. "But my humble knowledge is limited to the setting of a squadron in the field, and using it when there. I beg leave to refer you to Dr. Archibald Sitgreaves, a gentleman of universal attainments and unbounded philanthropy, the very milk of human sympathies, and a mortal foe to all indiscriminate cutting." The surgeon drew up and employed himself in whistling a low air, as he looked over some vials on a table, but the housekeeper, turning to him with an inclination of the head, continued, "I suppose, sir, a woman has no dower in her husband's property unless they be actually married." It was a maxim with Dr. Sitgreaves that no species of knowledge was to be despised, and consequently he was an empiric in everything but his profession. At first, indignation at the irony of his comrade kept him silent, but suddenly changing his purpose, he answered the applicant with a good-natured smile. "I judge not. If death has anticipated your nuptials, I'm fearful you have no remedy against his stern decrees." To Katy this sounded well, although she understood nothing of its meaning but death and nuptials. To this part of his speech then she directed her reply. "I did think he only waited the death of the old gentleman before he married," said the housekeeper, looking on the carpet. "But now he is nothing more than despisable, or, what's the same thing, a peddler without house-pack or money. It might be hard for a man to get a wife at all in such a predicary, don't you think it would, Miss Peyton?" "I seldom trouble myself with such things," said the lady gravely. During this dialogue, Captain Lawton had been studying the countenance and manner of the housekeeper with a most ludicrous gravity, and fearful the conversation would cease, he inquired with an appearance of great interest, "You think it was age and debility that removed the old gentleman at last?" "And the troublesome times. Trouble is a heavy pull-down to a sick-bed. But I suppose his time had come, and when that happens it matters but little what doctor's stuff we take." "Let me set you right in that particular," interrupted the surgeon. "We must all die, it is true, but it is permitted us to use the lights of science in arresting dangers as they occur, until—" "We can die secundum artem," cried the trooper. To this observation the physician did not deign to reply, but deeming it necessary to his professional dignity that the conversation should continue, he added, "Perhaps in this instance judicious treatment might have prolonged the life of the patient. Who administered to the case?" "No one yet," said the housekeeper with quickness. "I expect he has made his last will and testament." The surgeon disregarded the smile of the ladies and pursued his inquiries. "It is doubtless wise to be prepared for death, but under whose care was the sick man during his indisposition?" "Under mine," answered Katy, with an air of a little importance, "and care thrown away, I may well call it, for Harvey is quite too despisable to be any sort of compensation at present." The mutual ignorance of each other's meaning made very little interruption to the dialogue, for both took a good deal for granted, and Sitgreaves pursued the subject. "And how did you treat him?" "Kindly, you may be certain," said Katy, rather tartly. "The doctor means medically, madame," observed Captain Lawton, with a face that would have honoured the funeral of the deceased. "I doctored him mostly with yarbs," said the housekeeper, smiling, as if conscious of error. "With simples," returned the surgeon. "They are safer in the hands of the unlettered than more powerful remedies. But why had you no regular attendant?" "I'm sure Harvey has suffered enough already from having so much concerns with the wrigglers," replied the housekeeper. "He has lost his all, and made himself a vagabond through the land, and I have reason to rue the day I ever crossed the threshold of his house." "Dr. Sitgreaves does not mean a regular soldier, but a regular physician, madame," said the trooper. "Oh!" cried the maiden, again correcting herself, "for the best of all reasons. There was none to be had, so I took care of him myself. If there had been a doctor at hand, I'm sure we would have gladly had him. For my part, I am clear for doctoring, though Harvey says I am killing myself with medicines. But I am sure it will make but little difference to him whether I live or die." "Therein you show your sense," said the surgeon, approaching the spinster, who sat holding the palms of her hands and the soles of her feet to the genial heat of a fine fire, making the most of comfort amid all her troubles. "You appear to be a sensible, discreet woman, and some who have had opportunities of acquiring more correct views might envy you your respect for knowledge and the lights of science." Although the housekeeper did not altogether comprehend the other's meaning, she knew he used a compliment, and as such was highly pleased with what he said. With increasing animation, therefore, she cried, "It was always said of me that I wanted nothing but opportunity to make quite a physician myself, so long as before I came to live with Harvey's father they called me the petticoat doctor." "More true than civil, I dare say," returned the surgeon, losing sight of the woman's character in his admiration of her respect for the healing art. "In the absence of more enlightened counsellors, the experience of a discreet matron is frequently of great efficacy in checking the progress of disease. Under such circumstances, madame, it is dreadful to have to contend with ignorance and obstinacy." "Bad enough, as well I know from experience," cried Katy, in triumph. "Harvey is as obstinate about such things as a dumb beast. One would think the care I took of his bedridden father might learn him better than to despise good nursing. But some day he may know what it is to want a careful woman in his house, though now I am sure he is too despisable himself to have a house." "Indeed, I can easily comprehend the mortification you must have felt in having one so self-willed to deal with," returned the surgeon, glancing his eyes reproachfully at his comrade. "But you should rise superior to such opinions, and pity the ignorance by which they are engendered." The housekeeper hesitated a moment, at a loss to comprehend all that the surgeon expressed, yet she felt it was both complimentary and kind. Therefore, suppressing her natural flow of language a little, she replied, "I tell Harvey his conduct is often condemnable, and last night he made my words good. But the opinions of such unbelievers is not very consequential. Yet it is dreadful to think how he behaves at times. Now, when he threw away the needle—" "What?" said the surgeon, interrupting her. "Does he affect to despise the needle? But it is my lot to meet with men daily who are equally perverse, and who show a still more culpable disrespect for the information that flows from the lights of science." The doctor turned his face toward Captain Lawton while speaking, but the elevation of the head prevented his eyes from resting on the grave countenance maintained by the trooper. Katy listened with admiring attention, and when the other had done, she added, "Then Harvey is a disbeliever in the tides." "Not believe in the tides!" repeated the healer of bodies in astonishment. "Does the man distrust his senses? But perhaps it is the influence of the moon that he doubts." "That he does!" exclaimed Katy, shaking with delight at meeting a man of learning who could support her opinions. "If you was to hear him talk, you would think he didn't believe there was such a thing as a moon at all." "It is the misfortune of ignorance and incredulity, madame, that they feed themselves. The mind, once rejecting useful information, insensibly leans to superstition, and concludes on the order of nature that are not less prejudicial to the cause of truth than they are at variance with the first principles of human knowledge." The spinster was too much awestruck to venture an undigested reply to this speech, and the surgeon, after pausing a moment in a kind of philosophical disdain, continued, "That any man in his senses can doubt of the flux of the tides is more than I could have thought possible. Yet obstinacy is a dangerous inmate to harbor, and may lead us into any error, however gross." "You think, then, that they have an effect on the flux?" said the housekeeper, inquiringly. Miss Peyton rose and beckoned her nieces to give her their assistance in the adjoining pantry, while for a moment the dark visage of the attentive Lawton was lighted by an animation that vanished by an effort as powerful and sudden as the one that drew it into being. After reflecting whether he rightly understood the meaning of the other, the surgeon, making due allowance for the love of learning, acted upon a want of education, replied, "The moon, you mean. Many philosophers have doubted how far it affects the tides, but I think it is wilfully rejecting the lights of science not to believe it causes both the flux and reflux." As reflux was a disorder with which Katy was not acquainted, she thought it prudent to be silent, yet burning with curiosity to know the meaning of certain portentous lights to which the other so often alluded, she ventured to ask, "If them lights he spoke of were what was called northern lights in these parts?" In charity to her ignorance, the surgeon would have entered into an elaborate explanation of his meaning, had he not been interrupted by the mirth of Lawton. The trooper had listened so far with great composure, but now he laughed until his aching bones reminded him of his fall, and the tears rolled off his cheeks in larger drops than had ever been seen there before. At length the offended physician seized an opportunity of a pause to say, "To you, Captain Lawton, it may be a source of triumph that an uneducated woman should make a mistake in a subject on which men of science have long been at variance, but yet you find this respectable matron does not reject the lights, does not reject the use of proper instruments in repairing injuries sustained by the human frame. You may possibly remember, sir, her allusion to the use of a needle." "Aye," cried the delighted trooper, "to mend the peddler's breeches." Katy drew up in evident displeasure, and prompt to vindicate her character for more lofty acquirements, she said, "'Twas not a common use that I put that needle to, but one of much greater virtue." "Explain yourself, madame," said the surgeon impatiently, "that this gentleman may see how little reason he has for exultation." Thus solicited, Katy paused to collect sufficient eloquence to garnish her narrative. The substance of her tale was, that a child who had been placed by the guardians of the poor in the keeping of Harvey had, in the absence of its master, injured itself badly in the foot by a large needle. The offending instrument had been carefully greased, wrapped in woolen, and placed in a certain charmed nook of the chimney, while the foot, from a fear of weakening the incantation, was left in a state of nature. The arrival of the peddler had altered the whole of this admirable treatment, and the consequences were expressed by Katy as she concluded her narrative by saying, "'Twas no wonder the boy died of a lockjaw." Dr. Sitgreaves looked out of the window in admiration of the brilliant morning, striving all he could do to avoid the basilisk's eyes of his comrade. He was impelled by a feeling that he could not conquer, however, to look Captain Lawton in the face. The trooper had arranged every muscle of his countenance to express sympathy for the fate of the poor child, but the exultation of his eyes cut the astounding man of science to the quick. He muttered something concerning the condition of his patients, and retreated with precipitation. Miss Peyton entered into the situation of things at the house of the peddler, with all the interest of her excellent feelings. She listened patiently while Katy recounted, more particularly, the circumstances of the past night as they had occurred. The spinster did not forget to dwell on the magnitude of the pecuniary loss sustained by Harvey, and in no manner spared her invectives at his betraying a secret which might so easily have been kept. "For Miss Peyton," continued the housekeeper, after a pause to take breath, "I would have given up life before I would have given up that secret. At the most they could only have killed him, and now a body may say that they have slain both soul and body, or what's the same thing, they have made him a despisable vagabond. I wonder who he thinks would be his wife, or who would keep his house. For my part, my good name is too precious to be living with a lone man, though for the matter of that he is never there. I am resolved to tell him this day, that stay there as a single woman I will not, an hour after the funeral, and marry him I don't think I will, unless he becomes steadier and more of a homebody." The mild mistress of the Locusts suffered the exuberance of the housekeeper's feelings to expend itself, and then, by one or two judicious questions that denoted a more intimate knowledge of the windings of the human heart in matters of Cupid than might fairly be supposed to belong to a spinster, she extracted enough from Katy to discover the improbability of Harvey's ever presuming to offer himself, with his broken fortunes, to the acceptance of Catherine Haynes. She therefore mentioned her own want of assistance in the present state of her household, and expressed a wish that Katy would change her residence to the Locusts, in case the peddler had no further use for her services. After a few preliminary conditions on the part of the wary housekeeper, the arrangement was concluded, and making a few more piteous lamentations on the weight of her own losses and the stupidity of Harvey, united with some curiosity to know the future fate of the peddler, Katy withdrew to make the necessary preparations for the approaching funeral, which was to take place that day. During the interview between the two females, Lawton, through delicacy, had withdrawn. Anxiety took him to the room of Captain Singleton. The character of this youth, it has already been shown, endeared him in a peculiar manner to every officer in the corps. The singularly mild deportment of the young dragoon had on so many occasions been proved not to proceed from want of resolution, that his almost feminine softness of manner and appearance had failed to bring him into disrepute even in that band of partisan warriors. To the major he was as dear as a brother, and his easy submission to the directions of his surgeon had made him a marked favourite with Dr. Sitgreaves. The rough usage the corps often received in its daring attacks had brought each of its officers in succession under the temporary keeping of the surgeon. To Captain Singleton, the man of science had decreed the palm of docility on such occasions, and Captain Lawton he had fairly blackballed. He frequently declared, with unconquerable simplicity and earnestness of manner, that it gave him more pleasure to see the former brought in wounded than any officer in the squadron, and that the latter afforded him the least, a compliment and condemnation that were usually received by the first of the parties with a quiet smile of good nature, and by the last with a grave bow of thanks. On the present occasion the mortified surgeon and exulting trooper met in the room of Captain Singleton as a place where they could act on common ground. Some time was occupied in joint attentions to the comfort of the wounded officer, and the doctor retired to an apartment prepared for his own accommodation. Here, within a few minutes, he was surprised by the entrance of Lawton. The triumph of the trooper had been so complete that he felt he could afford to be generous, and commencing by voluntarily throwing aside his coat, he cried carelessly, "Sitgreaves, administer a little of the aid of the lights of science to my body, if you please." The surgeon was beginning to feel that this was a subject that was intolerable, but venturing a glance toward his comrade, he saw with surprise the preparations he had made, and an air of sincerity about him that was unusual to his manner when making such a request. Changing his intended burst of resentment to a tone of civil inquiry, he said, "Does Captain Lawton want anything at my hands?" "Look for yourself, my dear sir," said the trooper mildly. "Here seems to be most of the colors of the rainbow on this shoulder." "You have reason for saying so," said the other, handling the part with great tenderness and consummate skill, "but happily nothing is broken. It is wonderful how well you escaped." "I have been a tumbler from my youth, and I am past minding a few falls from a horse. But Sitgreaves," he added with affection, and pointing to a scar on his body, "do you remember this bit of work?" "Perfectly well, Jack. It was bravely obtained and neatly extracted. But don't you think I had better apply an oil to these bruises?" "Certainly," said Lawton with unexpected condescension. "Now, my dear boy," cried the doctor exultantly, as he busied himself in applying the remedy to the hurts, "do you not think it would have been better to have done all this last night?" "Quite probable." "Yes, Jack, but if you had let me perform the operation of phlebotomy when I first saw you, it would have been of infinite service." "No phlebotomy," said the other positively. "It is now too late, but a dose of oil would carry off the humours famously." To this the captain made no reply, but grated his teeth, in a way that showed the fortress of his mouth was not to be assailed without a resolute resistance, and the experienced physician changed the subject by saying, "It is a pity, John, that you did not catch the rascal after the danger and trouble you incurred." The captain of dragoons made no reply, and while placing some bandages on the wounded soldier, the surgeon continued, "If I have any wish at all to destroy human life, it is to have the pleasure of seeing that traitor hanged." "I thought your business was to cure and not to slay," said the trooper dryly. "Aye, but he has caused us such heavy losses by his information that I sometimes feel a very unsophistical temper towards that spy." "You should not encourage such feelings of animosity to any of your fellow creatures," returned Lawton, in a tone that caused the operator to drop a pin he was arranging in the bandages from his hand. He looked the patient in the face to remove all doubts of his identity. Finding, however, it was his old comrade, Captain John Lawton, who had spoken, he rallied his astonished faculties and proceeded by saying, "Your doctrine is just, and in general I subscribe to it. But, John, my dear fellow, is the bandage easy?" "Quite." "I agree with you as a whole, but as matter is infinitely divisible, so no case exists without an exception. Lawton, do you feel easy?" "Very." "It is not only cruel to the sufferer, but sometimes unjust to others, to take human life where a less punishment would answer the purpose. Now, Jack, if you were only— move your arm a little— if you were only— I hope you feel easier, my dear friend?" "Much." "If, my dear John, you would teach your men to cut with more discretion, it would answer you the same purpose, and give me great pleasure." The doctor drew a heavy sigh, as he was enabled to get rid of what was nearest to his heart, and the dragoon coolly replaced his coat, saying with great deliberation as he retired, "I know no troop that cut more judiciously. They generally shave from the crown to the jaw." The disappointed operator collected his instruments, and with a heavy heart proceeded to pay a visit to the room of Colonel Wellmere. End of Chapter 11. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Caroline Morse. The Spy by James Fenimore Cooper. Chapter 12. Quote, "This fairy form contains a soul as mighty as that which lives within a giant's frame. These slender limbs, that tremble like the aspen at summer's eve sigh, uphold a spirit which roused can tower to the height of heaven, and light those shining windows of the face with much of heaven's own radiance." Duo. Unquote. The number and character of her guests had greatly added to the cares of Miss Jeanette Peyton. The morning found them all restored, in some measure, to their former ease of body, with the exception of the youthful captain of dragoons, who had been so deeply regretted by Dunwoodie. The wound of this officer was severe, though the surgeon persevered in saying that it was without danger. His comrade, we have shown, had deserted his couch, and Henry Wharton awoke from a sleep that had been undisturbed by anything but a dream of suffering amputation under the hands of a surgical novice. As it proved, however, to be nothing but a dream, the youth found himself much refreshed by his slumbers, and Dr. Sitgreaves removed all further apprehensions by confidently pronouncing that he would be a well man within a fortnight. During all this time Colonel Wellmere did not make an appearance. He breakfasted in his own room, and notwithstanding certain significant smiles of the man of science, declared himself much too injured to rise from his bed. Leaving him, therefore, endeavouring to conceal his chagrin in the solitude of his chamber, the surgeon proceeded to the more grateful task of sitting an hour by the bedside of George Singleton. A slight flush was on the face of the patient as the doctor entered the room, and the latter advanced promptly and laid his fingers on the pulse of the youth, beckoning to him to be silent while he muttered, "Growing symptoms of a febrile pulse. No, no, my dear George, you must remain quiet and dumb, though your eyes look better, and your skin has even a moisture." "Nay, my dear Sitgreaves," said the youth, taking his hand, "you see there is no fever about me. Look, is there any of Jack Lawton's hoarfrost on my tongue?" "No, indeed," said the surgeon, clapping a spoon in the mouth of the other, forcing it open, and looking down his throat as if disposed to visit the interior in person. "The tongue is well, and the pulse begins to lower again. Ah, the bleeding did you good. Phlebotomy is a sovereign specific for southern constitutions, but that madcap Lawton absolutely refused to be blooded for a fall he had from a horse last night. Why, George, your case is becoming singular," continued the doctor, instinctively throwing aside his wig. "Your pulse even and soft, your skin moist, but your eye fiery, and cheek flushed. Oh, I must examine more closely into these symptoms." "Softly, my good friend, softly," said the youth, falling back on his pillow, and losing some of that colour which alarmed his companion. "I believe in extracting the ball you did for me all that is required. I am free from pain, and only weak, I do assure you." "Captain Singleton," said the surgeon with heat, "it is presumptuous in you to pretend to tell your medical attendant when you are free from pain, if it be not to enable us to decide in such matters of what avail the lights of science. For shame, George, for shame. Even that perverse fellow John Lawton could not behave with more obstinacy." His patient smiled, as he gently repulsed his physician in an attempt to undo the bandages, and with a returning glow to his cheeks inquired, "Do, Archibald," a term of endearment that seldom failed to soften the operator's heart, "tell me what spirit from heaven has been gliding around my apartment while I lay pretending to be asleep." "If anyone interferes with my patients," cried the doctor hastily, "I will teach them, spirit or no spirit, what it is to meddle with another man's concerns." "Tut, my dear fellow, there was no interference made, nor any intended. See," exhibiting the bandages, "everything is as you left it, but it glided about the room with the grace of a fairy and the tenderness of an angel." The surgeon, having satisfied himself that everything was as he left it, very deliberately resumed his seat and replaced his wig, as he inquired with a brevity that would have honoured Lieutenant Mason, "Had it petticoats, George?" "I saw nothing but its heavenly eyes, its bloom, its majestic step, its grace," replied the young man, with rather more ardour than his surgeon thought consistent with his debilitated condition, and he laid his hand on his mouth to stop himself, saying, "It must have been Miss Jeanette Peyton, a lady of fine accomplishments, with with something of the kind of step you speak of, a very complacent eye, and as to the bloom, I dare say offices of charity can summon as fine a colour to her cheeks as glows in the faces of her more youthful nieces." "Nieces? Has she nieces, then? The angel I saw may be a daughter, a sister, or a niece, but never an aunt." "Hush, George, hush. Your talking has brought your pulse up again. You must observe quiet, and prepare for a meeting with your own sister, who will be here within an hour." "What, Isabella? And who sent for her?" "The Major." "Consider it done, Woody," murmured the exhausted youth, sinking again on his pillow where the commands of his attendant compelled him to remain silent. Even Captain Lawton had been received with many and courteous inquiries after the state of his health from all the members of the family when he made his morning entrance, but an invisible spirit presided over the comforts of the English colonel. Sarah had shrunk with consciousness from entering the room, yet she knew the position of every glass, and had with her own hands supplied the contents of every bowl that stood on his table. At the time of our tale we were a divided people, and Sarah thought it was no more than her duty to cherish the institutions of that country to which she yet clung as the land of her forefathers, but there were other and more cogent reasons for the silent preference she was giving to the Englishman. His image had first filled the void in her youthful fancy, and it was an image that was distinguished by many of those attractions that can enchain a female heart. It is true he wanted the personal excellence of Peyton Dunwoodie, but his pretensions were far from contemptible. Sarah had moved about the house during the morning, casting frequent and longing glances at the door of Wellmere's apartment, anxious to learn the condition of his wounds, and yet ashamed to inquire. Conscious interest kept her tongue tied until her sister, with the frankness of innocence, had put the desired question to Dr. Sitgreaves. "Colonel Wellmere," said the operator gravely, "is in what I call a state of free will, madame. He is ill, or he is well, as he pleases. His case, young lady, exceeds my art to heal, and I take it Sir Henry Clinton is the best adviser he can apply to, though Major Dunwoodie has made the communication with his leech rather difficult." Frances smiled, but averted her face, while Sarah moved, with the grace of an offended Juno, from the apartment. Her own room, however, afforded her but little relief, and in passing through the long gallery that communicated with each of the chambers of the building, she noticed the door of Singleton's room to be open. The wounded youth seemed sleeping, and was alone. She had ventured lightly into the apartment, busied herself for a few minutes in arranging the tables, and the nourishment provided for the patient, hardly conscious of what she was doing, and possibly dreaming that these little feminine offices were performed for another. Her natural bloom was heightened by the insinuation of the surgeon, nor was the lustre of her eye in any degree diminished. The sound of the approaching footsteps of Sitgreaves hastened her retreat down a private stairway to the side of her sister. The sisters then sought the fresh air on the piazza, and as they pursued their walk arm in arm, the following dialogue took place. "There is something disagreeable about this surgeon of Dunwoodie," said Sarah, "that causes me to wish him away most heartily." Frances fixed her laughing eyes on her sister, but forbearing to speak, the other readily construed their expression, and hastily added, "But I forget he is one of your renowned corps of Virginians, and must be spoken of reverently." "As respectfully as you please, my dear sister. There is but little danger of exceeding the truth." "Not in your opinion," said the elder with little warmth, "but I think Mr. Dunwoodie has taken a liberty that exceeds the rights of consanguinity. He has made our father's house a hospital. We ought to be grateful that none of the patients it contains are dearer to us. Your brother is one." "True, true," interrupted Frances, blushing to the eyes, "but he leaves his room, and thinks his wound lightly purchased by the pleasure of being with his friends. If," she added with a tremulous lip, "this dreadful suspicion that is affixed to his visit were removed, I could consider his wound of little moment. You now have the fruits of rebellion brought home to you, a brother wounded and a prisoner, and perhaps a victim, your father distressed, his privacy interrupted, and not improbably his estates torn from him on account of his loyalty to his king." Frances continued her walk in silence. While facing the northern entrance to the vale, her eyes were uniformly fastened on the point where the road was suddenly lost by the intervention of a hill, and at each turn, as she lost sight of the spot, she lingered until an impatient movement of her sister quickened her pace to an even motion with that of her own. At length a single horse-chaise was seen making its way carefully among the stones which lay scattered over the country road that wound through the valley and approached the cottage. The colour of Frances changed as the vehicle gradually drew nearer, and when she was enabled to see a female form in it by the side of a black in livery, her limbs shook with an agitation that compelled her to lean on Sarah for support. In a few minutes the travellers approached the gate. It was thrown open by a dragoon who followed the carriage, and who had been the messenger dispatched by Dunwoodie to the father of Captain Singleton. Miss Peyton advanced to receive their guest, and the sisters united in giving her the kindest welcome. Still Frances could with difficulty withdraw her truant eyes from the countenance of their visitor. She was young, and of a light and fragile form, but of exquisite proportions. Her eyes were large, full, black, piercing, and at times a little wild. Her hair was luxuriant, and as it was without the powder it was then the fashion to wear, it fell in raven blackness. A few of its locks had fallen on her cheek, giving its chilling whiteness by the contrast a more deadly character. Dr. Sitgreaves supported her from the chaise, and when she gained the floor of the piazza she turned an expressive look on the face of the practitioner. "Your brother is out of danger and wishes to see you, Miss Singleton," said the surgeon. The lady burst into a flood of tears. Frances had stood contemplating the action and face of Isabella with a kind of uneasy admiration, but she now sprang to her side with the ardour of a sister, and kindly drawing her arm within her own, led the way to a retired room. The movement was so ingenuous, so considerate, and so delicate, that even Miss Peyton withheld her interference, following the youthful pair with only her eyes and a smile of complacency. The feeling was communicated to all the spectators, and they dispersed in pursuit of their usual avocations. Isabella yielded to the gentle influence of Frances without resistance, and having gained the room where the latter conducted her, wept in silence on the shoulder of the observant and soothing girl, until Frances thought her tears exceeded the emotion natural to the occasion. The sobs of Miss Singleton for a time were violent and uncontrollable, until, with an evident exertion, she yielded to a kind observation of her companion, and succeeded in suppressing her tears. Raising her face to the eyes of Frances, she rose, while a smile of beautiful radiance passed over her features, and making a hasty apology for the excess of her emotion, she desired to be conducted to the room of the invalid. The meeting between the brother and sister was warm, but, by an effort on the part of the lady, more composed than her previous agitation had given reason to expect. Isabella found her brother looking better and in less danger than her sensitive imagination had led her to suppose. Her spirits rose in proportion. From despondency she passed to something like gaiety. Her beautiful eyes sparkled with renovated brilliancy, and her face was lighted with smiles so fascinating that Frances, who, in compliance with her earnest entreaties, had accompanied her to the sick chamber, sat gazing on a countenance that possessed so wonderful variability, impelled by a charm that was beyond her control. The youth had thrown an earnest look at Frances, as soon as his sister raised herself from his arms, and perhaps it was the first glance at the lovely lineaments of our heroine. When the gazer turned his eyes from the view in disappointment, he seemed bewildered, rubbed his forehead like a man awaking from a dream, and mused. "Where is Dunwoodie, Isabella?" he said. "The excellent fellow is never weary of kind actions. After a day of such service as that of yesterday, he has spent the night in bringing me a nurse whose presence alone is able to raise me from my couch." The expression of the lady's countenance changed. Her eye roved around the apartment with a character of wildness in it that repelled the anxious Frances, who studied her movements with unabated interest. "Dunwoodie! Is he not here, then? I thought to have met him by the side of my brother's bed." "He has duties that require his presence elsewhere. The English are said to be out by the way of the Hudson, and they give us light troops but little rest. Surely nothing else could have kept him so long from a wounded friend. But, Isabella, the meeting has been too much for you. You tremble." Isabella made no reply. She stretched her hand toward the table which held the nourishment of the captain, and the attentive Frances comprehended her wishes in a moment. A glass of water in some measure revived the sister, who was enabled to say, "Doubtless it is his duty. 'Twas said above, a royal party was moving on the river, though I passed the troops but 2 miles from this spot." The latter part of the sentence was hardly audible, and it was spoken more in the manner of a soliloquy than as if for the ears of her companions. "On the march, Isabella?" eagerly inquired her brother. "No, dismounted and seemingly at rest," was the reply. The wondering dragoon turned his gaze on the countenance of his sister, who sat with her eye bent on the carpet in unconscious absence, but found no explanation. His look was changed to the face of Frances, who, startled by the earnestness of his expression, arose, and hastily inquired if he would have any assistance. "If you can pardon the rudeness," said the wounded officer, making a feeble effort to raise his body, "I would request to have Captain Lawton's company for a moment." Frances hastened instantly to communicate his wish to that gentleman, and, impelled by an interest she could not control, she returned again to her seat by the side of Miss Singleton. "Lawton," said the youth impatiently as the trooper entered, "hear you from the Major." The eye of the sister was now bent on the face of the trooper, who made his salutations to the lady with ease, blended with the frankness of a soldier. "His man has been here twice," he said, "to inquire how we fared in the lazaretto." "And why not himself?" "That is a question the Major can answer best, but you know the redcoats are abroad, and Dunwoodie commands in the county. These English must be looked to." "True," said Singleton slowly, as if struck with the other's reasons. "But how is it that you are idle when there is work to do?" "My sword arm is not in the best condition, and Roanoke has but a shambling gait this morning. Besides, there is another reason I could mention, if it were not that Miss Wharton would never forgive me." "Speak, I beg, without dread of my displeasure," said Frances, returning the good-humoured smile of the trooper with the archness natural to her own sweet face. "The odours of your kitchen, then," cried Lawton bluntly, "forbid my quitting the domains until I qualify myself to speak with more certainty concerning the fatness of the land." "Oh, Aunt Jeanette is exerting herself to do credit to my father's hospitality," said the laughing girl, "and I am a truant from her labors, as I shall be a stranger to her favor unless I proffer my assistance." Frances withdrew to seek her aunt, musing deeply on the character and extreme sensibility of the new acquaintance chance had brought to the cottage. The wounded officer followed her with his eyes, as she moved, with infantile grace, through the door of his apartment, and as she vanished from his view, he observed, "Such an aunt and niece are seldom to be met with, Jack. This seems a fairy, but the aunt is angelic. You are doing well, I see. Your enthusiasm for the sex holds its own. I should be ungrateful as well as insensible did I not bear testimony to the loveliness of Miss Peyton. A good motherly lady, but as to love, that is a matter of taste. A few years younger, with deference to her prudence and experience, would accord better with my fancy." "She must be under 20, said the other quickly. "It depends on the way you count. If you begin at the heel of life, well, but if you reckon downward, as is most common, I think she is nearer 40. "You have mistaken an elder sister for the aunt," said Isabella, laying her fair hand on the mouth of the invalid. "You must be silent. Your feelings are beginning to affect your frame." The entrance of Dr. Sitgreaves, who, in some alarm, noticed the increase of feverish symptoms in his patient, enforced this mandate, and the trooper withdrew to pay a visit of condolence to Roanoke, who had been an equal sufferer with himself in their last night's somersault. To his great joy, his man pronounced the steed to be equally convalescent with the master, and Lawton found that by dint of rubbing the animal's limbs several hours without ceasing, he was enabled to place his feet in what he called systematic motion. Orders were accordingly given to be in readiness to rejoin the troop at the Four Corners as soon as his master had shared in the bounty of the approaching banquet. In the meantime Henry Wharton entered the apartment of Wellmere, and by his sympathy succeeded in restoring the colonel to his own good graces. The latter was consequently enabled to rise, and prepared to meet a rival of whom he had spoken so lightly, as the result had proved, with so little reason. Wharton knew that their misfortune, as they both termed their defeat, was owing to the other's rashness, but he forbore to speak of anything except the unfortunate accident which had deprived the English of their leader, and to which he good-naturedly ascribed their subsequent discomfiture. "In short, Wharton," said the colonel, putting one leg out of bed, "it may be called a combination of untoward events. Your own ungovernable horse prevented my orders from being carried to the major, in season to flank the rebels." "Very true," replied the captain, kicking a slipper toward the bed. "Had we succeeded in getting a few good fires upon them in flank, we should have sent these brave Virginians to the right about." "Ay, and that in double quick time," cried the colonel, making the other leg follow its companion. "Then it was necessary to rout the guides, you know, and the movement gave them the best possible opportunity to charge." "Yes," said the other, sending the second slipper after the first, "and this Major Dunwoody never overlooks an advantage." "I think if we had the thing to do over again," continued the colonel, raising himself on his feet, "we might alter the case very materially, though the chief thing the rebels have now to boast of is my capture. They were repulsed, you saw, in their attempt to drive us from the wood." "At least they would have been had they made an attack," said the captain, throwing the rest of his clothes within reach of the colonel. "Why, that is the same thing," returned Wellmere, beginning to dress himself. "To assume such an attitude as to intimidate the enemy is the chief art of war." "Doubtlessly, then, you may remember in one of their charges they were completely routed." "True, true," cried the colonel with animation. "Had I been there to have improved that advantage, we might have turned the table on the Yankees." Saying which, he displayed still greater animation in completing his toilet, and he was soon prepared to make his appearance, fully restored to his own good opinion, and fairly persuaded that his capture was owing to casualties absolutely beyond the control of man. The knowledge that Colonel Wellmere was to be guest at the table in no degree diminished the preparations which were already making for the banquet, and Sarah, after receiving the compliments of the gentleman, and making many kind inquiries after the state of his wounds, proceeded in person to lend her counsel and taste to one of those laboured entertainments which at that day were so frequent in country life, and which are not entirely banished from our domestic economy at the present moment. Chapter 12. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Caroline Morse. The Spy by James Fenimore Cooper. Chapter 13. Quote, "I will stand to and feed, although my last." Tempest. End quote. The savour of preparation which had been noticed by Captain Lawton began to increase within the walls of the cottage. Certain sweet-smelling odours, that arose from the subterranean territories of Caesar, gave to the trooper the most pleasing assurances that his olfactory nerves, which on such occasions were as acute as his eyes on others, had faithfully performed their duty. and for the benefit of enjoying the passing sweets as they arose, the dragoon so placed himself at a window of the building that not a vapour charged with the spices of the East could exhale on its passage to the clouds, without first giving its incense to his nose. Lawton, however, by no means indulged himself in this comfortable arrangement, without first making such preparations to do meet honour to the feast as his scanty wardrobe would allow. The uniform of his corps was always a passport to the best tables, and this, though somewhat tarnished by faithful service and unceremonious usage, was properly brushed and decked out for the occasion. His head, which nature had ornamented with the blackness of a crow, now shone with the whiteness of snow, and his bony hand, that so well became the sabre, peered from beneath a ruffle with something like maiden coyness. The improvements of the dragoon went no further, except that his boots shone with more than holiday splendour, and his spurs glittered in the rays of the sun, as became the pure ore of which they were composed. Caesar moved through the apartments with a face charged with an importance exceeding even that which had accompanied him in his melancholy task of the morning. The black had early returned from the errand on which he had been dispatched by the pedlar, and, obedient to the commands of his mistress, promptly appeared to give his services where his allegiance was due. So serious indeed was his duty now becoming, that it was only at odd moments he was able to impart to his sable brother, who had been sent in attendance on Miss Singleton to the Locusts, any portion of the wonderful incidents of the momentous night he had so lately passed. By ingeniously using, however, such occasions as accidentally offered, Caesar communicated so many of the heads of his tale as served to open the eyes of his visitor to their fullest width. The gusto for the marvellous was innate in these sable worthies, and Miss Peyton found it necessary to interpose her authority in order to postpone the residue of the history to a more befitting opportunity. "Ah, Miss Jeanette," said Caesar, shaking his head and looking all that he expressed, "'twas awful to see Johnny Birch walk on a feet when he lie dead." This concluded the conversation, though the black promised himself the satisfaction, and did not fail to enjoy it, of having many a gossip on the subject at a future period. The ghost thus happily laid, the department of Miss Peyton flourished, and by the time the afternoon's sun had travelled a 2 hours' journey from the meridian, the formal procession from the kitchen to the parlour commenced, under the auspices of Caesar, who led the van, supporting a turkey on the palms of his withered hands, with the dexterity of a balanced master. Next followed the servant of Captain Lawton, bearing, as he marched stiffly and walking wide, as if allowing room for his steed, a ham of true Virginian flavour, a present from the spinster's brother in a comic. The supporter of this savoury dish kept his eye on his trust with military precision, and by the time he reached his destination it might be difficult to say which contained the most juice, his own mouth or the acomic bacon. Third in line was to be seen the valet of Colonel Wellmere, who carried in either hand chickens fricasseed and oyster patties. After him marched the attendant of Dr. Sitgreaves, who had instinctively seized an enormous tureen, as most resembling matters he understood, and followed on in place until the steams of the soup so completely bedimmed the spectacles he wore as a badge of office, that on arriving at the scene of action he was compelled to deposit his freight on the floor until, by removing the glasses, he could see his way through the pile of reserved china and plate-warmers. Next followed another trooper, whose duty it was to attend on Captain Singleton, and as if apportioning his appetite to the feeble state of his master, he had contented himself with conveying a pair of ducks, roasted, until their tempting fragrance began to make him repent his having so lately demolished a breakfast that had been provided for his master's sister, with another prepared for himself. The white boy, who belonged to the house, brought up the rear, groaning under a load of sundry dishes of vegetables that the cook, by way of climax, had unwittingly heaped on him. But this was far from all of the preparations for that day's feast. Caesar had no sooner deposited his bird, which, but the week before, had been flying amongst the highlands of Duchess, little dreaming of so soon heading such a goodly assemblage, than he turned mechanically on his heel and took up his line of march again for the kitchen. In this evolution the black was imitated by his companions in succession, and another procession to the parlour followed in the same order. By this admirable arrangement, whole flocks of pigeons, certain bevies of quails, shoals of flatfish, bass, and sundry woodcock found their way into the presence of the company. A third attack brought suitable quantities of potatoes, onions, beets, cold slaw, rice, and all the other minutiae of a goodly dinner. The board now fairly groaned with American profusion, and Caesar, glancing his eye over the show with a most approving conscience, after readjusting every dish that had not been placed on the table with his own hands, proceeded to acquaint the mistress of the revels that his task was happily accomplished. Some half-hour before the culinary array just recorded took place, all the ladies disappeared, much in the same unaccountable manner that swallows flee the approach of winter. But the springtime of their return had arrived, and the whole party were collected in an apartment that, in consequence of its containing no side table, and being furnished with a chintz coverlet settee, was termed a withdrawing room. The kind-hearted spinster had deemed the occasion worthy, not only of extraordinary preparations in the culinary department, but had seen proper to deck her own person in garments suited to the guests whom it was now her happiness to entertain. On her head Miss Peyton wore a cap of exquisite lawn, which was ornamented in front with a broad border of lace, that spread from the face in such a manner as to admit of a display of artificial flowers clustered in a group on the summit of her fine forehead. The colour of her hair was lost in the profusion of powder with which it was covered, but a slight curling of the extremities in some degree relieved the formality of its arrangement, and gave a look of feminine softness to the features. Her dress was a rich, heavy silk of violet colour, cut low around the bust, with a stomacher of the same material, that fitted close to the figure, and exhibited the form, from the shoulders to the waist, in its true proportions. Below, the dress was full, and sufficiently showed that parsimony in attire was not a foible of the day. A small loop displayed the beauty of the fabric to advantage, and aided in giving majesty to the figure. The tall stature of the lady was heightened by shoes of the same material with the dress, whose heels added more than an inch to the liberality of nature. The sleeves were short, and close to the limb, until they fell off at the elbows in large ruffles, that hung in rich profusion from the arm when extended, and duplicates and triplicates of lawn, trimmed with Dresden lace, lent their aid in giving delicacy to a hand and arm that yet retained their whiteness and symmetry. A treble row of large pearls closely encircled her throat, and a handkerchief of lace partially concealed that part of the person that the silk had left exposed, but which the experience of 40 years had warned Miss Peyton should now be veiled. Thus attired, and standing erect with the lofty grace that distinguished the manners of that day, the maiden would have looked into nothingness a bevy of modern belles. The taste of Sarah had kept even pace with the decorations of her aunt, and a dress, differing in no respect from the one just described but in material and tints, exhibited her imposing form to equal advantage. The satin of her robe was of a pale bluish colour. 20 years did not, however, require the screen that was prudent in 40, and nothing in an envious border of exquisite lace hid, in some measure, what the satin left exposed to view. The upper part of the bust and the fine fall of the shoulders were blazing in all their native beauty, and like the aunt, the throat was ornamented by a treble row of pearls, to correspond with which were rings of the same quality in the ears. The head was without a cap, and the hair drawn up from the countenance so as to give to the eye all the loveliness of a forehead as polished as marble and as white as snow. A few straggling curls fell gracefully on the neck, and a bouquet of artificial flowers was also placed, like a coronet, over her brow. Miss Singleton had resigned her brother to the advice of Dr. Sitgreaves, who had succeeded in getting his patient into a deep sleep after quieting certain feverish symptoms that followed the agitation of the interview. The sister was persuaded by the observant mistress of the mansion to make one of the party, and she sat by the side of Sarah, differing but little in appearance from that lady, except in refusing the use of powder on her raven locks, and that her unusually high forehead and large, brilliant eyes gave an expression of thoughtfulness to her features that was possibly heightened by the paleness of her cheek. Last and least, but not the most unlovely in this display of female charms, was the youngest daughter of Mr. Wharton. Frances, we have already mentioned, left the city before she had attained the age of fashionable womanhood. A few adventurous spirits were already beginning to make inroads in those customs which had so long invaded the comforts of the fair sex, and the youthful girl had ventured to trust her beauty to the height which nature had bestowed. This was but little, but that little was a masterpiece. Frances several times had determined, in the course of the morning, to bestow more than usual pains in the decoration of her person. Each time in succession, as she formed this resolution, she spent a few minutes in looking earnestly towards the north, and then she as invariably changed it. At the appointed hour, our heroine appeared in the drawing-room, clothed in a robe of pale blue silk, of a cut and fashion much like that worn by her sister. Her hair was left to the wild curls of nature, its exuberance being confined to the crown of her head by a long, low comb, made of light tortoise-shell, a colour barely distinguishable in the golden hue of her tresses. Her dress was without a plait or a wrinkle, and fitted the form with an exactitude that might lead one to imagine the arch girl more than suspected the beauties it displayed. A tucker of rich Dresden lace softened the contour of the figure. Her head was without ornament, but around her throat was a necklace of gold, clasped in the front with a rich cornelian. Once, and only once, as they moved toward the repast, did Lawton see a foot thrust itself from beneath the folds of her robe, and exhibit its little beauties encased in a slipper of blue silk, clasped close to the shape by a buckle of brilliants. The trooper caught himself sighing as he thought, though it was good for nothing in the stirrup, how enchantingly it would grace a minuet. As the black appeared on the threshold of the room, making a low reverence, which has been interpreted for some centuries into dinner waits, Mr. Wharton, clad in a dress of drab, bedecked with enormous buttons, advanced formally to Miss Singleton, and bending his powdered head nearly to the level of the hand he extended, received hers in return. Dr. Sitgreaves offered the same homage to Miss Peyton, and met with equal favour, the lady first pausing to draw on her gloves. Colonel Wellmere was honoured with a smile from Sarah while performing a similar duty, and Frances gave the ends of her taper fingers to Captain Lawton with maiden bashfulness. Much time and some trouble were expended before the whole party were, to the great joy of Caesar, comfortably arranged around the table, with proper attention to all points of etiquette and precedence. The black well knew the viands were not improving, and though abundantly able to comprehend the disadvantage of eating a cold dinner, it greatly exceeded his powers of philosophy to weigh all the latent consequences to society which depended on social order. Much time and some trouble were expended before the whole party were, to the great joy of Caesar, comfortably arranged around the table, with proper attention to all points of etiquette and precedence. Dr. Sitgreaves offered the same homage to Miss Peyton, and met with equal favour, the lady first pausing to draw on her gloves. The black well knew the viands were not improving, and though abundantly able to comprehend the disadvantage of eating a cold dinner, it greatly exceeded his powers of philosophy to weigh all the latent consequences to society which depend on social order. For the first 10 minutes all but the captain of dragoons found themselves in a situation much to their liking. Even Lawton would have been perfectly happy, had not excess of civility on the part of his host and Miss Jeanette Peyton kept him from the more agreeable occupation of tasting dishes he did want, in order to decline those he did not. At length, however, the repast was fairly commenced, and a devoted application on the viands was more eloquent than 1,000 words in favour of Dinah's skill. Next came drinking with the ladies, but as the wine was excellent and the glasses ample, the trooper bore this interruption with consummate good nature. Nay, so fearful was he of giving offence, and of omitting any of the nicer points of punctilio, that having commenced this courtesy with the lady who sat next to him, he persevered until not one of his fair companions could, with justice, reproach him with partiality in this particular. Long abstemiousness from anything like generous wine might plead the excuse of Captain Lawton, especially when exposed to so strong a temptation as that now before him. Mr. Wharton had been one of a set of politicians in New York, whose principal exploits before the war had been to assemble, and to pass sage opinions on, the signs of the times, under the inspiration of certain liquor made from a grape that grew on the south side of the island of Madeira, and which found its way into the colonies of North America through the medium of the West Indies, sojourning a while in the western archipelago, by way of proving the virtues of the climate. A large supply of this cordial had been drawn from his storehouse in the city, and some of it now sparkled in a bottle before the captain, blushing in the rays of the sun which were passing obliquely through it like amber. Though the meat and vegetables had made their entrance with perfect order and propriety, their exeunt was effected much in the manner of the retreat of militia. The point was to clear the board something after the fabled practice of the harpies, and by dint of scrambling, tossing, breaking, and spilling, the remnants of the overflowing repast disappeared. And now another series of processions commenced, by virtue of which a goodly display of pastry, with its usual accompaniments, garnished the table. Mr. Wharton poured out a glass of wine for the lady who sat on his right hand, and pushing the bottle to a guest, said with a low bow, "We are to be honoured with a toast from Miss Singleton." Although there was nothing more in this movement than occurred every day on such occasions, yet the lady trembled, coloured, and grew pale again, seemingly endeavouring to rally her thoughts, until, by her agitation, she had excited the interest of the whole party, when by an effort, and in a manner as if she had striven in vain to think of another, Isabella said faintly, "Major Dunwoodie." The health was drunk cheerfully by all but Colonel Wellmere, who wet his lips, and drew figures on the table with some of the liquor he had spilled. At length Colonel Wellmere broke silence by saying aloud to Captain Lawton, "I suppose, sir, this Mr. Dunwoodie will receive promotion in the rebel army, for the advantage my misfortune gave him over my command." The trooper had supplied the wants of nature to his perfect satisfaction, and perhaps, with the exception of Washington and his immediate commander, there was no mortal whose displeasure he regarded a tittle. First helping himself, therefore, to a little of his favorite bottle, he replied with admirable coolness, "Colonel Wellmere, your pardon. Major Dunwoodie owes his allegiance to the Confederated States of North America, and where he owes it he pays it. Such a man is no rebel. Promoted I hope he may be, both because he deserves it, and because I am next in rank in the corps, and I know not what you call a misfortune unless you deem meeting the Virginia horse as such." "We will not differ about terms, sir," said the colonel haughtily. "I spoke as duty to my sovereign prompted, but do you not call the loss of a commander a misfortune to a party?" "It certainly may be so," said the trooper with emphasis. "Miss Peyton, will you favor us with a toast?" cried the master of the house, anxious to stop this dialogue. The lady bowed her head with dignity as she named General Montrose, and the long-absent bloom stole lightly over her features. "There is no term more doubtful than that word misfortune," said the surgeon, regardless of the nice manoeuvres of the host. "Some deem one thing a misfortune, others its opposite. Misfortune begets misfortune. Life is a misfortune, for it may be the means of enduring misfortune. And death is a misfortune, as it abridges the enjoyments of life." "It is a misfortune that our mess has no wine such as this," interrupted the trooper. "We will pledge you a sentiment in it, sir, as seems to suit your taste," said Mr. Wharton. Lawton filled to the brim and drank. "A speedy peace, or a stirring war." "I drink your toast, Captain Lawton, though I greatly distrust your construction of activity," said the surgeon. "In my poor judgment, cavalry should be kept in the rear to improve a victory, and not sent in front to gain it. Such may be said to be their natural occupation, if the term can be used in reference to so artificial a body, for all history shows that the horse have done the most when held in reserve." This dissertation, uttered in a sufficiently didactic manner, was a hint that Miss Peyton did not neglect. She arose and retired, followed by her juniors. Nearly at the same moment, Mr. Wharton and his son made an apology for their absence, which was required on the account of the death of a near neighbor, and withdrew. The retreat of the ladies was the signal for the appearance of the surgeon's cigar, which, being established in a corner of his mouth, in a certain knowing way, caused not the slightest interruption to his discourse. "If anything can sweeten captivity and wounds, it must be the happiness of suffering in the society of the ladies who have left us," gallantly observed the colonel as he resumed his seat after closing the door. "Sympathy and kindness have their influence on the human system," returned the surgeon, knocking the ashes from his cigar, with the tip of a little finger, in the manner of an adept. "The connection is intimate between the moral and physical feelings, but still, to accomplish a cure, and restore nature to the healthy tone it has lost from disease or accident, requires more than can flow from unguided sympathies. In such cases, the lights—" The surgeon accidentally caught the eye of the trooper, and he paused. Taking 2 or 3 hasty puffs, he essayed to finish the sentence. "In such cases, the knowledge that flows from the lights—" "You were saying," said Colonel Wellmere, sipping his wine. "The purport of my remark went to say," continued Sitgreaves, turning his back on Lawton, "that a bread poultice would not set a broken arm." "More's the pity," cried the trooper, "for next to eating, the nourishment could not be more innocently applied." "To you, Colonel Wellmere," said the surgeon, "as a man of education, I can with safety appeal." The colonel bowed. "You must have observed the dreadful havoc made in your ranks by the men who were led by this gentleman." The colonel looked grave again. "How, when blows lighted on their frame, life was invariably extinguished beyond all hope of scientific reparation. How certain yawning wounds were inflicted, that must set at defiance to the art of the most experienced practitioner. Now, sir, to you I triumphantly appeal, therefore, to know whether your detachment would not have been as effectually defeated if the men had all lost a right arm, for instance, as if they had all lost their heads." "The triumph of your appeal is somewhat hasty, sir," said Wellmere. "Is the cause of liberty advanced a step by such injudicious harshness in the field?" continued the surgeon, bent on the favorite principle of his life. "I am yet to learn that the cause of liberty is in any manner advanced by the services of any gentleman in the rebel army," rejoined the colonel. "Not liberty! Good God, for what, then, are we contending?" "Slavery, sir. Yes, even slavery. You are putting the tyranny of a mob on the throne of a kind and lenient prince. Where is the consistency of your boasted liberty?" "Consistency!" repeated the surgeon, looking about him a little wildly, at hearing such charges against a cause he had so long thought holy. "Ay, sir, your consistency. Your Congress of Sages have published a manifesto, wherein they have set forth the equality of political rights. 'Tis true, and it is done most ably. I say nothing of its ability, but if true, why not set your slaves at liberty? This argument, which is thought by most of the Colonel's countrymen a triumphant answer to 1,000 eloquent facts, lost none of its weight by the manner in which it was uttered. Every American feels humbled at the necessity of vindicating his country from the apparent inconsistency and injustice of the laws alluded to. His feelings are much like those of an honorable man who is compelled to exonerate himself from a disgraceful charge, although he may know the accusation to be false. At the bottom, Sitgreaves had much good sense, and thus called upon he took up the cudgel's argument in downright earnest. We deem it a liberty to have the deciding voice in the councils by which we are governed. We think it a hardship to be ruled by the king of a people who live at a distance of 3,000 miles, and who cannot, and who do not, feel a single political interest in common with ourselves. I say nothing of oppression. The child was of age, and was entitled to the privileges of majority. In such cases there is but one tribunal to which to appeal for a nation's rights. It is power, and we now make the appeal. Such doctrines may suit your present purposes, said Wellmere with a sneer, but I apprehend it is opposed to all the opinions and practices of civilized nations. It is in conformity with the practices of all nations, said the surgeon, returning the nod and smile of Lawton, who enjoyed the good sense of his comrade as much as he disliked what he called his medical talk. Who would be ruled when he can rule? The only rational ground to take is that every community has a right to govern itself, so that in no manner it violates the laws of God. And is holding your fellow creatures in bondage in conformity to those laws? Asked the colonel impressively. The surgeon took another glass, and hemming once, returned to the combat. Sir, he said, slavery is of very ancient origin, and it seems to have been confined to no particular religion or form of government. Every nation of civilized Europe does, or has held, their fellow creatures in this kind of duress. You will accept Great Britain, cried the colonel proudly. No, sir, continued the surgeon confidently, feeling that he was now carrying the war out of his own country. I cannot accept Great Britain. It was her children, her ships, and her laws that first introduced the practice into these states, and on her institutions the judgment must fall. There is not a foot of ground belonging to England in which a negro would be useful that has not its slave. England herself has none, but England is overflowing with physical force, a part of which she is obliged to maintain in the shape of paupers. The same is true of France and most other European countries. So long as we were content to remain colonies, nothing was said of our system of domestic slavery. But now, when we are resolute to obtain as much freedom as the vicious system of metropolitan rule has left us, that which is England's gift has become our reproach. Will your master liberate the slaves of his subjects, should he succeed in subduing the new states? Or will he condemn the whites to the same servitude as that in which he has been so long content to see the blacks? It is true we continue the practice, but we must come gradually to the remedy, or create an evil greater than that which we endure at present. Doubtless, as we advance, the manumission of our slaves will accompany us, until happily these fair regions shall exist without a single image of the Creator that is held in a state which disqualifies him to judge of that Creator's goodness. It will be remembered that Dr. Sitgreaves spoke 40 years ago, and Wellmere was unable to contradict his prophetic assertion. Finding the subject getting to be knotty, the Englishman retired to the apartment in which the ladies had assembled, and seated by the side of Sarah, he found a more pleasing employment in relating the events of fashionable life in the metropolis, and in recalling the 1,000 little anecdotes of their former associates. Miss Peyton was a pleased listener as she dispensed the bounties of the tea-table, and Sarah frequently bowed her blushing countenance to her needlework, as her face glowed at the flattering remarks of her companion. The dialogue we have related established a perfect truce between the surgeon and his comrade, and the former having paid a visit to Singleton, they took their leave of the ladies and mounted, the former to visit the wounded at the encampment, and the latter to rejoin his troop. But their movements were arrested at the gate by an occurrence that we shall relate in the next chapter. End of chapter 13.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kim Zuckert, Tales of the Brass Hedgehog, at hedgehog.net. The Spy, by James Fenimore Cooper, Chapter 14. I see no more those white locks thinly spread round the bald polish of that honored head, no more that meek, that supplicant look in prayer, nor that pure faith that gave it force are there. But he is blessed, and I lament no more, a wise, good man, contented to be poor. Crabbe. We have already said that the customs of America leave the dead but a short time in sight of the mourners, and the necessity of providing for his own safety had compelled the peddler to abridge even this brief space. In the confusion and agitation produced by the events we have recorded, the death of the elder Birch had occurred unnoticed, but a sufficient number of the immediate neighbors were hastily collected, and the ordinary rites of sepulture were now about to be paid to the deceased. It was the approach of this humble procession that arrested the movements of the trooper and his comrade. 4 men supported the body on a rude bier, and 4 others walked in advance, ready to relieve their friends from their burden. The peddler walked next to the coffin, and by his side moved Katy Haynes, with the most determined aspect of woe, and next to the mourners came Mr. Wharton and the English captain. 2 or 3 old men and women, with a few straggling boys, brought up the rear. Captain Lawson sat in his saddle in rigid silence until the bearers came opposite to his position, and then, for the first time, Harvey raised his eyes from the ground and saw the enemy that he had dreaded so near him. The first impulse of the peddler was certainly flight, but recovering his recollection, he fixed his eye on the coffin of his parent, and passed the dragoon with a firm step but swelling heart. The trooper slowly lifted his cap, and continued uncovered until Mr. Wharton and his son had moved by, when, accompanied by the surgeon, he rode leisurely in the rear, maintaining an inflexible silence. Caesar emerged from the cellar kitchen of the cottage, and with a face of settled solemnity added himself to the number of the followers of the funeral, though with a humble mien and at a most respectful distance from the horsemen. The old negro had placed around his arm, a little above the elbow, a napkin of unsullied whiteness, it being the only time since his departure from the city that he had enjoyed an opportunity of exhibiting himself in the garniture of servile mourning. He was a great lover of propriety, and had been a little stimulated to this display by a desire to show his sable friend from Georgia all the decencies of a New York funeral, and the ebullition of his zeal went off very well, producing no other result than a mild lecture from Miss Peyton at his return on the fitness of things. The attendance of the black was thought well enough in itself, but the napkin was deemed a superfluous exhibition of ceremony at the funeral of a man who had performed all the menial offices in his own person. The graveyard was an enclosure on the grounds of Mr. Wharton, which had been fenced with stone and set apart for the purpose by that gentleman some years before. It was not, however, intended as a burial place for any of his own family. Until the fire, which raged as the British troops took possession of New York, had laid Trinity in ashes, a goodly gilded tablet on its walls proclaimed the virtues of his deceased parents, and beneath a flag of marble in one of the aisles of the church, their bones were left to moulder in aristocratical repose. Captain Lawton made a movement as if he was disposed to follow the procession when it left the highway, to enter the field which contained the graves of the humble dead, but he was recalled to recollection by a hint from his companion that he was taking the wrong road. "Of all the various methods which have been adopted by man for the disposal of his earthly remains, which do you prefer, Captain Lawton?" said the surgeon, as they separated from the little procession. "In some countries the body is exposed to be devoured by wild beasts. In others it is suspended in the air to exhale its substance in the manner of decomposition. In other regions it is consumed on the funeral pyre, and again it is inhumed in the bowels of the earth. Every people have their own particular fashion. And to which do you give the preference?" "All are agreeable," said the trooper, following the group they had left with his eyes, "though the speediest interments give the cleanest fields. Of which are you an admirer?" "The last, as practised by ourselves, but the other 3 are destructive of all the opportunities for dissection, whereas in the last the coffin can lie in peaceful decency, while the remains are made to subserve the useful purposes of science. Ah, Captain Lawson, I enjoy comparatively but few opportunities of such a nature to what I expected upon entering the army." "To what may these pleasures numerically amount in a year?" said the captain, withdrawing his gaze from the graveyard. "Within a dozen, upon my honor. My best picking is when the corps is detached, for when we are with the main army there are so many boys to be satisfied that I seldom get a good subject. Those youngsters are as wasteful as prodigals and as greedy as vultures." "A dozen!" echoed the trooper in surprise. "Why, I furnish you that number with my own hands." "Ah, Jack," returned the doctor, approaching the subject with great tenderness of manner, "it is seldom I can do anything with your patients. You disfigure them woefully. Believe me, John, when I tell you as a friend that your system is all wrong. You unnecessarily destroy life, and then you injure the body so it is unfit for the only use that can be made of a dead man." The trooper maintained a silence, which he thought would be the most probable means of preserving peace between them, and the surgeon, turning his head from taking a last look at the burial, as they rode round the foot of the hill that shut the valley from their sight, continued with a suppressed sigh. "One might get a natural death from that graveyard tonight, if there was but time and opportunity. The patient must be the father of the lady we saw this morning." "The petticoat doctor, she with the aurora borealis complexion," said the trooper with a smile that began to cause uneasiness to his companion. "But the lady was not the gentleman's daughter, only his medico-petticoat attendant, and the Harvey, whose name was made to rhyme with every word in her song, is the renowned peddler's spy." "What? He who unhorsed you?" "No man ever unhorsed me, Dr. Sitgreaves," said the dragoon gravely. "I fell by mischance of Roanoke. Rider and beast kissed the earth together." "A warm embrace from the love spots it left on your cuticle. 'Tis a thousand pities that you cannot find where the tattling rascal lies hid." "He followed his father's body." "And you let him pass?" cried the surgeon, checking his horse. "Let us return immediately and take him. Tomorrow you shall have him hanged, Jack, and damn me, I'll dissect him." "Softly, softly, my dear Archibald. Would you arrest a man while paying the last offices to a dead father? Leave him to me, and I pledge myself he shall have justice." The doctor muttered his dissatisfaction at any postponement of vengeance, but he was compelled to acquiesce, from a regard to his reputation for propriety, and they continued their ride to the quarters of the corps, engaged in various discussions concerning the welfare of the human body. Birch supported the grave and collected manner that was thought becoming in a male mourner on such occasions, and to Katy was left the part of exhibiting the tenderness of the softer sex. There are some people whose feelings are of such nature that they cannot weep unless it be in proper company, and the spinster was a good deal addicted to this congregational virtue. After casting her eyes around the small assemblage, the housekeeper found the countenances of the few females who were present fixed on her in solemn expectation, and the effect was instantaneous. The maiden really wept, and she gained no inconsiderable sympathy and some reputation for a tender heart from the spectators. The muscles of the peddler's face were seen to move, and as the first clod of earth fell on the tenement of his father, sending up that dull, hollow sound that speaks so eloquently the mortality of man, his whole frame was for an instant convulsed. He bent his body down, as if in pain. His fingers worked while the hands hung lifeless by his side, and there was an expression in his countenance that seemed to announce a writhing of the soul, but it was not unresisted, and it was transient. He stood erect, drew a long breath, and looked around him with an elevated face that even seemed to smile with the consciousness of having obtained the mastery. The grave was soon filled. A rough stone, placed at either extremity, marked its position, and the turf, whose faded vegetation was adapted to the fortunes of the deceased, covered the little hillock with the last office of seemliness. This office ended, the neighbors, who had officiously pressed forward to offer their services in performing their solemn duty, paused, and, lifting their hats, stood looking towards the mourner, who now felt himself to be really alone in the world. Uncovering his head also, the peddler hesitated a moment to gather energy, and spoke. "My friends and neighbors," he said, "I thank you for assisting me to bury my dead out of my sight." A solemn pause succeeded the customary address, and the group dispersed in silence, some few walking with the mourners back to their own habitation, but respectfully leaving them at its entrance. The peddler and Katy were followed into the building by one man, however, who was well known to the surrounding county by the significant term of a speculator. Katy saw him enter, with a heart that palpitated with dreadful forebodings, but Harvey civilly handed him a chair, and evidently was prepared for the visit. The peddler went to the door, and, taking a cautious glance about the valley, quickly returned, and commenced the following dialogue. "The sun has just left the top of the eastern hill. My time presses me. Here is the deed for the house and lot. Everything is done according to law." The other took the paper, and conned its contents with a deliberation that proceeded partly from his caution, and partly from the unlucky circumstance of his education having been much neglected when a youth. The time occupied in this tedious examination was employed by Harvey in the gathering together certain articles which he intended to include in the stores that were to leave the habitation with himself. Katy had already inquired of the peddler whether the deceased had left a will, and she saw the Bible placed in the bottom of a new pack, which she had made for his accommodation, with the most stoical indifference. But as the 6 silver spoons were laid carefully by its side, a sudden twinge of her conscience objected to such a palpable waste of property, and she broke silence. "When you marry, Harvey, you may miss those spoons." "I shall never marry." "Well, if you don't, there's no occasion to make rash promises, even to yourself. One never knows what one may do. In such a case, I should like to know of what use so many spoons can be to a single man. For my part, I think it is a duty for every man who is well provided to have a wife and family to maintain." At the time when Katy expressed this sentiment, the fortune of women in her class of life consisted of a cow, a bed, the labors of their own hands in the shape of divers pillow-cases, blankets, and sheets, with, where fortune was unusually kind, a half-dozen silver spoons. The spinster herself had obtained all the other necessities by her own industry and prudence, and it can be easily imagined that she saw the articles she had long counted her own vanish in the enormous pack, with a dissatisfaction that was in no degree diminished by the declaration that had preceded the act. Harvey, however, disregarded her opinions and feelings, and continued his employment of filling the pack, which soon grew to something like the ordinary size of the peddler's burden. "I'm rather timorsome about this conveyance," said the purchaser, having at length waded through the covenants of the deed. "Why so?" "I'm afraid it won't stand good in law. I know that 2 of the neighbors leave home tomorrow morning to have the place entered for confiscation, and if I should give £40 and lose it all, 'twould be a dead pull back to me." "They can only take my right," said the peddler. "Pay me $200, and the house is yours. You are a well-known Whig, and you at least they won't trouble." As Harvey spoke, there was a strange bitterness of manner, mingled with the shrewd care he expressed concerning the sale of his property. "Say 100, and it's a bargain," returned the man, with a grin that he meant for a good-natured smile. "A bargain?" echoed the peddler in surprise. "I thought the bargain already made." "Nothing is a bargain," said the purchaser with a chuckle, "until papers are delivered and the money paid in hand." "You have the paper." "Ah, and will keep it, if you will excuse the money." "Come, say 150, and I won't be hard. Here is just the money." The peddler looked from the window, and saw with dismay that the evening was fast advancing, and knew well that he endangered his life by remaining in the dwelling after dark. Yet he could not tolerate the idea of being defrauded in this manner in a bargain that had already been fairly made, and he hesitated. "Well," said the purchaser, rising, "mayhap you can find another man to trade with between this and morning, but if you don't, your title won't be worth much afterwards." "Take it, Harvey," said Katy, who felt it impossible to resist a tender like the one before her, for the purchase money was in English guineas. Her voice roused the peddler, and a new idea seemed to strike him. "I agree to the price," he said, and turning to the spinster, he placed part of the money in her hand, and as he continued, "Had I other means to pay you, I would have lost all rather than suffer myself to be defrauded of part." "You may lose all yet," muttered the stranger with a sneer, as he rose and left the building. "Yes," said Katy, following him with her eyes. "He knows you're failing, Harvey. He thinks with me, now the old gentleman is gone, you will want a careful body to take care of your concerns." The peddler was busied in making arrangements for his departure, and he took no notice of this insinuation, while the spinster returned again to the attack. She had lived for so many years in expectation of a termination to her hopes, so different from that which now seemed likely to occur, that the idea of separation began to give her more uneasiness than she had thought herself capable of feeling about a man so destitute and friendless. "Have you another house to go to?" inquired Katy. "Providence will provide me with a home." "Yes," said the housekeeper, "but maybe 'twill not be to your liking." The poor must not be difficult." "I'm sure I'm anything but a difficult body," cried the spinster, very hastily. "But I love to see things becoming and in their places, yet I wouldn't be hard to persuade to leave this place myself. I can't say I altogether like the ways of the people hereabouts." "The valley is lovely," said the peddler with fervor, "and the people like all the race of man. But to me it matters nothing. All places are now alike, and all faces equally strange." As he spoke, he dropped the article he was packing from his hand, and seated himself on a chest with a look of vacant misery. "Not so, not so," said Katy, shoving her chair nearer to the place where the peddler sat. "Not so, Harvey. You must know me, at least. My face cannot be strange to you." Birch turned his eyes slowly on her countenance, which exhibited more of feeling and less of self than he had ever seen there before. He took her hand kindly, and his own features lost some of their painful expression as he said, "Yes, good woman, you at least are not a stranger to me. You may do me partial justice. When others revile me, possibly your feelings may lead you to say something in my defense." "That I will, that I would," said Katy, eagerly. "I will defend you, Harvey, to the last drop. Let me hear them that dare to revile you. You say true, Harvey, I am partial and just to you. What if you do like the king? I have often heard it said he was at the bottom a good man, but there's no religion in the old country, for everyone allows the ministers are desperate bad." The peddler paced the floor in evident distress of mind. His eyes had a look of wildness that Katy had never witnessed before, and his step was measured, with a dignity that appalled the housekeeper. "While my father lived," murmured Harvey, unable to smother his feelings, "there was one who read my heart. And oh, what a consolation to return from my secret marches of danger, and the insults and wrongs that I suffered, to receive his blessing and his praise. But he is gone," he continued, stopping and gazing wildly towards the corner that used to hold the figure of his parent. "And who is there to do me justice?" "Why, Harvey, Harvey!" "Yes, there is one who will, and who must know me before I die. Oh, it is dreadful to die and leave such a name behind me." "Don't talk of dying, Harvey," said the spinster, glancing her eye around the room and pushing the wood in the fire to obtain a light from the blaze. The ebullition of feeling in the peddler was over. It had been excited by the events of the past day, and a vivid perception of his sufferings. It was not long, however, that passion maintained an ascendancy ever the reason of this singular man, and perceiving that the night had already thrown an obscurity around objects without doors, he hastily threw his pack over his shoulders, and taking Katy kindly by the hand, in leave-taking. "It is painful to part with even you, good woman," he said, "but the hour has come, and I must go. What is left in the house is yours. To me it could be of no use, and it may serve to make you more comfortable. Farewell. We shall meet hereafter." "In the regions of darkness!" cried a voice that caused the peddler to sink on the chest from which he had fallen in despair. "What! Another pack, Mr. Birch, and so well stuffed so soon?" "Have you not done evil enough?" cried the peddler, regaining his firmness and springing to his feet with energy. "Is it not enough to harass the last moments of a dying man, to impoverish me? What more would you have?" "Your blood," said the Skinner, with cool malignity. "And for money," cried Harvey bitterly, "like the ancient Judas, you would grow rich with the price of blood. Aye, and a fair price it is, my gentleman. 50 guineas, nearly the weight of that carcass of yours in gold." "Here," said Katy, promptly, "here are 15 guineas, and these drawers and this bed are all mine. If you will give Harvey but 1 hour's start from the door, they shall be yours." "1 hour," said the Skinner, showing his teeth, and looking with a longing eye at the money. "But a single hour. Here, take the money." "Hold!" cried Harvey. "Put no faith in the miscreant." "She may do what she pleases with her faith," said the Skinner, with malignant pleasure, "but I have the money in good keeping. As for you, Mr. Birch, we will bear your insolence for the 50 guineas that are to pay for your gallows." "Go on," said the peddler, proudly. "Take me to Major Dunwoodie. He at least may be kind, although just." "I can do better than by marching so far in such disgraceful company. This Mr. Dunwoodie has let 1 or 2 Tories go at large, but the troop of Captain Lawton is quartered some half-mile nearer, and his receipt will get me the reward as soon as his major's. How relish you the idea of supping with Captain Lawton this evening, Mr. Birch?" Give me my money, or set Harvey free!" cried the spinster in alarm. "Your bribe was not enough, good woman, unless there is money in this bed." Thrusting his bayonet through the ticking and ripping it for some distance, he took a malicious satisfaction in scattering its contents about the room. "If," cried the housekeeper, losing sight of her personal danger and care for her newly acquired propriety, "there is law in the land, I will be righted." "The law of the neutral ground is the law of the strongest, but your tongue is not as long as my bayonet. You had, therefore, best not set them at loggerheads, or you might be the loser." A figure stood in the shadow of the door, as if afraid to be seen in the group of Skinners, but a blaze of light, raised by some articles thrown in the fire by his persecutors, showed the peddler the face of the purchaser of his little domain. Occasionally there was some whispering between this man and the Skinner nearest him, that induced Harvey to suspect he had been the dupe of a contrivance in which that wretch had participated. It was, however, too late to repine, and he followed the party from the house with a firm and collected tread, as if marching to a triumph, and not to a gallows. In passing through the yard, the leader of the band fell over a billet of wood, and received a momentary hurt from the fall. Exasperated at the incident, the fellow sprang on his feet, filling the air with execrations. "The curse of heaven light on the log!" he exclaimed. "The night is too dark for us to move in. Throw that brand of fire in yon pile of tow to light up the scene." "Hold!" roared the speculator. "You'll fire the house." "And see the farther," said the other, hurling the brand in the midst of the combustibles. In an instant the building was in flames. "Come on! Let us move toward the heights while we still have light to pick our road." "Villain!" cried the exasperated purchaser. "Is this your friendship? This my reward for kidnapping the peddler?" "'Twould be wise to move more from the light if you mean to entertain us with abuse, or we may see too well to miss our mark," cried the leader of the gang. The next instant he was as good as his threat, but happily missed the terrified speculator, an equally appalled spinster, who saw herself again reduced from comparative wealth to poverty by the blow. Prudence dictated to the pair a speedy retreat, and the next morning the only remains of the dwelling of the peddler was the huge chimney we have already mentioned. End of chapter 14.